Each spirit has its own habitat, for example. Stone spirits inhabit mountains, but the earth spirits are assigned a place of settlement on land where they dwell, and accordingly, the water spirits found their abode in the waters of the rivers. At the same time, all these spirits have in common that the people of Donhe call them Sainasimi, who can manifest themselves in various forms. And there are those among the Sanasimi who often help people. But there are also those Sanasimi that, unlike the former, can do irreparable harm. However, in one way or another, spirits are mostly afraid of people and try to stay as far away from them as possible, avoiding unnecessary meetings. But it's different when the Sanasimi are possessed by a wild boar that stalks its prey. It should be kept in mind that for every action there is a counteraction, as in the case of the Sanasimi hunter, who does not intend to surrender to his executioner so easily and aims to assert his right to exist. And at this time, the hunter has already bared his battle weapon with all his might and brings it over his opponent, a huge wild boar. In this case, the hunter's combat weapon unmistakably hits the enemy without giving him any chance to escape. And as much as Sanasim begs for mercy, the hunter needs his strength, which means the hunter alone is responsible for everything he's done. So, the hunter, having put an end to the wild boar, is now focused on absorbing the power of the defeated Sanasim. But to the hunter's dismay, despite his best efforts, this power is still not enough, which means the hunter has to work even harder to get the Sanson's powers. And the hunter of Sansons must find not ordinary Sansons, but more powerful than the previous ones. And with these thoughts, the Sanshin hunter sits beside the fire he has built and sinks into himself. Suddenly, the foot of an uninvited guest appears on the smell of the fire. It seems that the hunter sitting with his back to the monster does not notice it at all, not even aware of its presence. However, the monster continues to watch him stealthily peeking out from behind the leaves of the shrubbery. The monster, unable to hold back, asks the hunter to leave him some food because he hasn't eaten for months. After all, the monster is asking for the smallest little bits of food, and that's all it needs from the hunter. However, otherwise there will be an outcome for the hunter that he will not like at all in case he refuses to share the food. Since in this case, the hunter himself will become the prey of that very hungry monster. But it seems that the words spoken by the monster do not frighten the hunter, who begins to pull out his battle weapon, from which comes the sign. And already the hunter's hand is grasping the face of the attacking monster, coming in from behind. The monster itself is at a disadvantage to the hunter when it is thrown over the hunter. For at this very moment, the hunter is preparing to bring his battle weapon over the monster, and now the blade is plunged into the body of the monster, confessing that because of hunger, he has to survive in this way. However, even these words do not allow the hunter to have mercy on the monster, as the hunter himself is familiar with the feeling. In doing so, the hunter absorbing the monster's power sees where his story begins, and that the monster himself falls into his own trap. And further, as on the rolled monster, being still a man, asks for help from those who may be near him. But this endless hunger torments him so much that he is ready to eat anything, be it animal or human. And so, the hunter's destruction of the monster not only saves the hunter, but also saves the monster from endless hunger. Suddenly, the hunter notices that a strange disturbance begins to emanate from his battle weapon. And among other things, the hunter's gaze notices another stirring that makes him concentrate fully. But then the hunter's gaze stumbled upon a wandering man who was probably in search of the hunter himself, as the guest's sense of relief is mixed with a sense of joy that the fire has brought him to the hunter, who still has his hand on his battle weapon, quite surprised that the guest is already in place. However, the guest is stopped by a horrible smell that comes from the monster the hunter has just destroyed. It is only when the guest leaves the stinking place and dips his feet into the river that he tells the hunter that he has something to tell him. At the same time, the hunter himself sitting near his guest wants to listen to what the guest wants to tell him. And the guest begins to tell the hunter that he knows of 3 spirits that live in the mountains, but his narrative is cut short by the hunter. But the guest decides that the hunter has no desire to talk about them right now. However, the whole reason is that the mountain spirits are done, and it's time to move on to the others. And the guest decides to tell the story of a monk who appears only at night, while he lost his life during the battle from hunger. But this story is not interesting to the hunter, who knows directly the true reason for the monk's passing, and it is a trap, not hunger. And the guest, deciding that the hunter is not interested in listening to his stories, makes another attempt and starts to tell about the ogre. However, in this quest, the the hunter needs to join the escort, and receiving a scroll from a guest, the hunter realizes he has another job. And the thing is, a royal convoy came through town recently. The mule was carrying something that is guarded by a large number of armed guards, and here the hunter needs to find out what the convoy is ferrying. But the royal convoy is coming through the mountains, and even though he has enough escorts, the hunter must join them. However, of all the above, there is no mention of an ogre, so the hunter wants to know what he has to do with it. And the guest goes on to say that recently there has been an unfavorable trend for travelers who lose their lives in the mountains. And the ogre eats not only animals, but people too. That's why he gets that nickname. In addition, the priest Do-Roa has already sent hundreds of mercenaries to search for them, but still no one knows who is taking everyone's life. However, the guest notices that the hunter is leaving him answering the guest's question by saying that this information is perfectly sufficient for him. The guest wants to know why the hunter continues to destroy the Sansons, because he could be in big trouble. But the hunter does not dignify his guest with an answer to the question put to him, and just tosses the guest a final note that they'll see each other again soon. And on that note, the hunter leaves his guest moving into the thick of the forest. But it seems that this is not enough for the guest, as he wants them to go down the mountain together, because it is very scary to go further alone. And after a while, the hunter of the Sansons, navigating on the map, concludes that he missed them since at the second hill of the mountain door of the Gather. And as things stand, wouldn't it be better for the Sanson hunter to go back? As suddenly the Sanson hunter's attention begins to pick up on something, bringing him back to reality from his thoughts. And now he's on his way with incredible speed, covering the distance. Yes, it all happens so fast that the trees start to replace each other, and the hunter is focused only on the final target. He's already in place, but what the Sanshin hunter sees in front of him makes him retrace his steps. As before his gaze amidst a large number of bereaved people sitting on his lap is a girl. That said, the Sanson's hunter is well aware that when you hunt game about 9 out of 10 times, you get nothing. However, this time is different, as the Sanson hunter decides that he has finally found what he needs. At that, his uncle turns to a Sanshin hunter named Seihi and wants to know what his plans are, to which Seihi replies that he has some work to do, which he asks his uncle not to ask for details about. Meanwhile, Seihi stands amongst the defeated people and looks at the white-haired girl who doesn't seem to be aware of his presence. Suddenly, the white-haired girl begins to turn her gaze to Seihi, who in the meantime pulls out his battle weapon, pondering that people can live in such a place without any sense of fear. And parallel to his thoughts, Seihi notices that the battle weapon he's pulling out doesn't show any reaction, which means you have to be prepared for anything and keep your ears open. And the first thing to do is to go to the white-haired child to find out how the girl got to these places. But instead of any answer to the question, the snow-white child points Sei to where the wounded man lies bleeding. And Seihu, seeing the condition the man is in, concludes that these wounds were caused by an animal attack. Besides, if you look closely at the current state of a person and the amount of blood he has lost, you can decide that he is already in heaven. But you can probably tell if you get close to the person. But is it really all the work of this snow-white girl? And approaching the wounded Se, seeing that he's conscious, he wants to know how he's feeling. The wounded man, however, also wants to know who appeared before him, and immediately learns from Seihu that he was sent to these parts by his uncle. In addition, the wounded man wants to know if this is the man the old man sent to help them. And then Seihu begins to realize that based on the wounded man's words, he is one of them, without taking too long to answer the question in the affirmative. At this, the white-haired girl to whom the conversation reaches learns that the wounded man is called the 52nd most captured Sanson, and Seihu, looking at the state of the 52nd, boldly remarks that he can't catch the 53rd, which makes 52 laugh, but the wounds he received cause him unbearable pain, and so Seihu decides to examine his wound. He asks the 52nd man to tell Sei what had happened at this place during the examination. And to the request of the 52nd, Seihu says no, because if he starts moving, he'll say goodbye to life faster while pulling out the needle, but still insisting on a story from which he learns that 52nd and his gang are to raid the convoy. However, everything started earlier than expected and ended smoothly as a man from the convoy heading to the royal palace was alive. And it was with this man that 52 was supposed to have a conversation regarding what they were carrying in the crate. Besides, if the 52nd is satisfied with the speaker's answer, there is a chance that he will be kept alive. But it turns out this is not at all what a captive man asking to take his life with a request not to open the box under any pretext needs. And it was these words that managed to send shivers through the 52nd's body, unlike his comrades, who did not realize what would follow. After all, at first the wagon contained gold bars with a girl sitting next to it, and the very iron box that was told not to touch. And the people of the 52nd made a huge mistake the moment they decided to open the iron box. For in this very iron box is a huaimori, known as the rhythm of traditional Korean music played on a drum. And 50 Second should have listened to the old man, but instead, he's trying to learn about jajimori and gutkori traditional Korean rhythms. And if so, 50 Second suggests that before sounding the alarm, given what has happened, we should decide what to do with the iron box. To which immediately one of those present protests, since he knows about all of Donghei's special items. But he had never heard of a thing to be kept in an iron box unless it was a royal guard in front of them. At the same time, the 50 Second refuting thought about the danger thinks that the king's property should go with the king's guard. And seeing the iron box, 50 Second, by virtue of his ignorance in such matters, realizes that a powerful talisman is used. Besides, it is well known that in order to get such a talisman, you have to pay a shaman 100 niangs, and in this case, as much as 10 niangs were used. And putting aside all unpleasant thoughts, 50 Second orders his men to open the iron box. At the same time, everyone who saw what was in the box holding their combat weapons at the ready can't understand what's going on. For in the iron box beneath the 10 mascots is a curled up Snow White girl, accompanied by the entire royal guard, and if the king is known to be using children, he will be immediately taken dead. But these assumptions are immediately cut off by the 50 Second, as it makes no sense to put a child in a box they want to have fun with. At that, the 50 Second does not have time to finish his guess as the white-haired girl rises to her feet and leaves the box. And it's picking up so much speed that 52 and his gang can barely stay on their feet. And yet 52 trying to stop the white-haired girl, trying to find out who she was. Not only that, but demand a specific answer as to where he plans to go. But instead of answering, the Snow White girl points her finger to where her home is, where she is going to return to. However, the 50 Second is not satisfied with this answer, and holding the Snow White girl by the shoulder, he wants to know where her home is. And again, instead of a specific answer, the Snow White girl turning her blue glowing eyes on the 50 Second said she was leaving. At that, it seems that a mere glance was enough for the 50 Second to stop his further attempts. And no more trying to catch up with the Snow White girl, but unfortunately, it was then that the 50 Second did not immediately realize his mistake, and the Snow White girl, leaving behind the bewildered 50 Second and his fellow gang members with great speed, continues to move away. And the head of the gang is once again convinced that he is making a blunder, but still gives orders to catch up with her before she passes through the Dorisen Mountains, at the same time losing his temper because the 50 Second takes full responsibility for what happened and asks only to follow him silently. Among other things, the 50 Second knew about the cannibal of Mount Dorisan, but didn't take it seriously taking such a decision. Meanwhile, the white-haired girl listening to the 50 Second story waits with bated breath for the continuation. Sehu continues darning the 50 Second looking at the girl and can't believe it's the child that came out of the box. And the 50 Second can no longer bear the pain and is preparing to go to the other world, but he has to endure to survive. In addition, Sehu decides to distract the wounded man from his pain by asking him to continue the story in which the 50 Second man finds the girl who escaped. And one of the members of the 50 Second gang gives out the suggestion that the Snow White girl could be either Sanshin or something else. The head of the gang, pleased with the opportunity, says that the girl Sanshin, his new name will be the 53rd. Besides, 52 has a battle weapon that's famous for destroying spirits. But the monologue of the head of the gang is interrupted by the cry of one of the repaired signaling that the girl has been found. The Snow White girl, standing with her back to her pursuers, does not give any sign that she is aware of their presence, and the 50 Second, also seeing the Snow White girl, begins to call her and ordering her to stay put because 52 and his gang want to take her home. But if the white-haired girl makes another escape attempt, she will be severely punished by the gang of 52. However, all the white-haired girl says in return for the sneer is a plea to not dare approach her, which is bewildering to the 50 Second person who doesn't understand what's starting to happen. And the white-haired girl, already shouting, repeats to the 50 Second and his gang that they dare not follow her, which further drives into incomprehensibility. The 50 Second who narrating says that this is what becomes the beginning of the future nightmare. But then no one has any idea what's to follow, only to be told to grab the girl and get away from the mountain. In this case, the speaker's speech is interrupted at half a word, because literally in a matter of seconds, he loses his head. And this is noticed by his interlocutor, who does not have time to orient himself as everything starts to happen very quickly. With that, the lightning-fast monster flying through the members of the 50 Second gang begins eliminating one by one of them. And the 50 Second, seeing that he is not dealing with an ordinary creature, orders the surviving comrades to take their position, who can't figure out what's going on and what it is that's running at such breakneck speed. At the same time, The 52nd, having exposed his weapon, continues to give orders that no one should dare to scatter, but only to dodge. But it doesn't help, and already one more person from his gang, having been attacked by the beast, goes into the minus. Yes, and the 52nd falls under the crush of the monster that appeared, but still survives. And here, already weakened but still conscious with a combat weapon at the ready, the 52nd sees who is doing all this. For at this very moment, Sanshin appears before the 52nd in a form resembling a marten or ferret, who stands at full height before the 52nd preparing to deliver his death blow. At that, the 52nd has nothing to do but to meet his death with dignity with a battle weapon in his hands. Already Sanshin is swinging his sharp claws at the 52nd man, which, when hit by Sanshin, flies backwards with tremendous force, and with a tremendous blow crashes into a standing stone. And Sanshin, having already reached his victim again, decides to finish the 52nd. That being said, all that now remains for the wounded 52nd is to humbly await his end, as suddenly a white-haired girl appears before the 52nd face of Sanshin, who with her frenzied energy drives Sanshin away, thus protecting the 52nd. At the same time, the 52nd had already come to his senses in astonishment at the fact that some girl was able to drive away the furious Sanshin, and defeated this time, Sanshin removes from the scene of the fight at breakneck speed, leaving the girl and the 52nd man alone. And the 52nd already finally coming to his senses and looking at the girl, wondering that she is an angel who came for his soul. But to the surprise of the 52nd girl turning her gaze to him, has no idea what he's talking. As well as Seihu, who listening to 52's story, has a different idea of an angel. But what could the 52nd survivor think of the girl in such a situation only because of her? Which is even more perplexing to Seihu, who continues to stare at the 52nd with interest. And all Seihu gives out is an appreciation for storytelling, followed by a call to rise to the occasion to leave these places. But hearing this, the 52nd reminds Sei that, according to what he was told earlier, he should not move with such wounds. In addition, the 52nd is very interested in whether Seihu is trained in medicine, to which the same receives the answer that it is only first aid. However, it is necessary to decide what they will do, the child who at this time begins to learn the bow, namely, the bowstring. But the white-haired girl has no luck, and instead gets a bowstring on her forehead, in the place of which there is now a large bruise, without paying attention to what Seihu is talking about with the 52nd, which he decides to help Sei by putting his shoulder under him and throwing the 52nd over. And on top of everything else, Seihu notices that the white-haired girl is about to follow them, and the 52nd, asking Seihu to wait a few minutes, asks for forgiveness from his fallen friends, while making a promise to them that after some time the 52nd would return with those who could take care of their bodies. But time is of the essence, and the 52nd, leaning on Seihu's shoulder, decides to continue the return journey. However, Seihu, who at this time sees the Snow White girl, is not left with the words said by the 52nd regarding the angel. For even after the 52nd has seen with his own eyes, the power of this child continues to call it by that word. Besides, there's a chance that 52 is the cannibal everyone's talking about. And the white-haired girl who continues to follow Seihu and the 52nd is Sanshin. And if that was indeed the case, then without any regret on Seihu's part, they would both become his prey. And a short time later, an angel in human form descends from heaven in visions of the 52nd, who sees an angel in a dream and thinks he is coming for his soul and will finally go to heaven. Suddenly, the beautiful leading of the 52nd is interrupted by the speech of a white-haired girl saying she is hungry. And having opened his eyes, 52, from unexpectedly close eye contact with the Snow White child, can't hold back an exclamation. And Seihu, seeing the 52nd coming to his senses and getting rid of his delirium, starts calling out to him. With the 52nd looking around and holding on to the wound site, he can't believe they're still in this place. And all because the 52nd had lost consciousness, and Sei had no choice but to organize a halt. In the meantime, the child, paying no attention to the 52nd's apology, notices a glowing dot hovering in the air trying to catch it. Sei wonders if the elder said anything about the iron box, but the 52nd only knows that Khan Musa is due to arrive. And if so, then it is quite obvious that the child and the cannibal in the mountains of Dorisan are in no way related to each other, and cannot be otherwise. And that means that the 52nd didn't see the cannibal, not only because of the quickness of what happened, but because he never met him. However, 52 is 100% sure that Sanshin is behind all the trouble. Also, the 52nd shows Sei what's left of his battle weapon after his last encounter with Sanshin. And that's considering that this ghost-catching sword made of willow is the best in Dongyi, and ordinary fiends can't do such a thing. However, Seihu's attention is diverted to another outgoing sound that comes from a peckish white-haired girl, and Seihu decides to leave the 52nd and the child for a while to go for food himself, as he himself is hungry. But apparently this outcome doesn't quite suit the 52nd, as he expects to continue down the mountain. However, Seihu is of a different opinion, knowing that the mountain trail, especially at night, is very dangerous. Besides, the 52nd should realize that the next time he faints, it will be too hard on Sei. The 52nd again apologizes to Seihu, who jokingly asks him to stay by the fire and wait. And so, Seihu, leaving the child with the 52nd, goes off to get some food, while the 52nd looks after Sei and thinks how the latter is not afraid to walk alone in the woods. But apparently the reason is that the second one became much weaker, and it was his fault that all his men lost their lives. Or maybe the 52nd to drop everything to go to the temple and continue to live there begging God for forgiveness. And only the Snow White child, not paying any attention to the 52nd, fascinated by the luminous dot, chases after it. But if the 52nd wanted to do so, would he be allowed to do so? Because he would never be able to just talk to the Grand Elder. However, if you think hard enough, Han seems to be very familiar with the Grand Elder, and none of the mercenaries as known to the 52nd had ever met the Grand Elder in person. Suddenly, the 52nd's musings are interrupted, and the latter thinks it is Seihu returning so quickly with his captured prey. But to the great surprise of the 52nd, instead of Seihu and the rabbit, the very same Sanshin who destroyed all his men appears before him. At that, Sanshin's eyes glitter furiously, and his bestial grin informs that he is preparing for an imminent attack. And at this very moment, the 52nd realizes that he is doomed and begins to accept the inevitability of it all. That being said, all 52 can do in this situation is to pick up and kick away what's left of his battle weapon. And now, the 52nd, with his eyes squeezed shut and his hands crossed on his forehead, falls to his knees in front of Sanshin for the sole purpose of bowing before him and learning what the Great Spirit needed from the 52nd. Meanwhile, the child who appeared looking at Sanshin's bowed 52nd doesn't understand what's going on, and only Sanshin, looking at the gesture of the 52nd, notes that such his greeting characterizes the 52nd as a polite man. However, it's all about the 52nd battle weapon that can harm the appearing Sanshin. At this, Sanshin decides to spare the 52nd and let him off the mountain if he does the right thing and doesn't tell anyone anything. And still bowing his head to Sanshin, 52 decides it's a done deal. And if so, why does the Great Spirit choose to do this to the 52nd? However, the Great Spirit passes the 52nd moving in a completely different direction from him, since the goal of the Great Spirit is not the 52nd, but the same Snow White child who appears before him unafraid, and the 52nd in this case is left only to watch from the sidelines. At the same time, the Great Spirit looks at the Snow White child and wants to know the child's name, who at this time is looking at the Great Spirit without fear, pondering his answer. After all the Snow White child can say is that she doesn't know her name. But in that case, the Great Spirit wants to know about the white-haired child's home, namely from which mountain she is from. However, this question also stumps the white-haired child, who wants to clarify the mountain from which she comes means Sanshin. And since that's the case, the place the Snow White baby comes from has a huge number of trees. And besides, there is always a strong wind blowing in the places of the white child, and she starts to portray it. And it's snowing where she lives, which means the Great Spirit needs to visit her, which obviously throws the Great Spirit into some confusion, since that's not what he wants to hear. However, the Great Spirit thinks that what he has heard is enough for him, since in one case or another, it doesn't matter what mountain the child is from. After all the Great Spirit needs from a child at this point is her flesh and blood. And at this time, the 52nd, realizing that he is unable to do anything about the situation, and unable to bow any longer, returns to his seat. In this case, the Snow White child again does not understand anything, and what means her flesh and blood that the Great Spirit wants to get. It's more likely that Sanshin wants to eat the Snow White baby, and since that's the case, the girl is against. But the Great Spirit doesn't care what the girl thinks about it, and all he can do is apologize for the consequences. However, the Great Spirit's intentions are not destined to come true, as someone appears who distracts Sanshin from his plan. That said, the emerging Seihu believes that for the Sanshin who is defined by his battle weapons, it is not enough to just eat people need his kind. Sei also doesn't care about Sanshin's opinion, as he only wants his body and soul. And that pisses Sanshin off because he doesn't understand what right Seihu has to say that to the master of Dora-san for 300 years. And who is this Seihu who dares to speak to the Great Spirit in such a tone? And Seihu at this time, removing his headdress, appears to be Sanshin, appearing before the Great Spirit in human form. But even so, wouldn't the Great Spirit recognize Seihu as an old acquaintance? Seihu is ready to face his nemesis, the Great Spirit, which in turn, bristling and posturing for an attack any minute now, is ready to lunge at Seiha. However, there is still something that stops the Great Spirit, and that is the power that Seihu radiates, in which the Great Spirit recognizes the Black Tiger by the shape released from the sword. But this is impossible because according to the Great Spirit, the Black Tiger should have been sent to heaven long ago, which clearly angered Seiha, since it was the Black Tiger in human form that was now standing in front of the Great Spirit. However, the Great Spirit is still curious to know what the Black Tiger is doing in these parts, who in turn does not hesitate to tell the Great Spirit that he has come to devour him. However, the Great Spirit does not want to give up so easily, because he has lived on this land for 300 years, not to fall at the hands of the Black Tiger. But the Black Tiger didn't care at all how many years the Great Spirit had lived, and the latter, despite the Black Tiger in front of him, isn't going to just sit back. However, Black Tiger didn't even have such a thought, because a monster without a battle never surrenders, which is the truth. And this statement is even more beginning to anger the Great Spirit, who under no circumstances intends to retreat, and ready to immediately lunge at the Black Tiger, standing just across the street with his battle weapon bared for protection. With that, the first step is taken, and the Great Spirit is lightning fast, bouncing away from Seihu, and the velocity of the Great Spirit is so great that only the blurred outlines testify to its presence. And now, the Great Spirit, who had just stood opposite the Black Tiger, finds himself above the head of the Black Tiger, reaching out to him, who manages to grab the Great Spirit by the tip of its tail, holding it tightly. And now, it's the turn of the Black Tiger, who manages to strike the Great Spirit with his battle weapon. The blow is so powerful it throws the Great Spirit back, causing heavy damage. At the same time, Seihu wastes no time in continuing to pursue the Great Spirit, keeping his battle weapons at the ready at all times. But the Great Spirit does not want to give up so easily, and again becomes in a militant posture preparing to attack. However, the Black Tiger is ahead of the Great Spirit's actions, and swinging his battle weapon is about to strike from above. That said, the Great Spirit seems unprepared for this turn of events, and fails to react in time, since at this very moment, the Black Tiger's battle weapon collapses onto the Great Spirit's head, which once again, with lightning speed, escapes the hands of the Black Tiger. At the same time, it seems that the Great Spirit gliding past the trees now has a different purpose. Suddenly, right in front of the Great Spirit, a Black Tiger appears at the same speed and swings its battle weapon. And now the blow clearly reaches its goal and deprives the Great Spirit of part of his left ear. But now 52 notices that it is he who is becoming the next victim of the Great Spirit, who grabs a seated 52 straight up by the head. And now the 52nd soaring through the sky with his head reaped in his paws is the captive of the Great Tiger. At the same time realizing that this is not the end as the power with which the Great Spirit holds the 52nd is beginning to weaken. And now the 52nd devoid of any support begins to fall from a great height. And the Great Spirit, having left his victim, begins to move toward another set goal in the person of the child. At the same time, the 52nd noticing how the Great Spirit is removed, continues its free flight to the ground, and only one thought now occupies the whole head of the 52nd, that sweat thus, he will meet his end. But something is beginning to catch the attention of the continuing downward plummeting 52nd, and it's the hand of a man approaching from above that's reaching towards him, who just in time manages to grab the 52nd man by the bloody hem of his ripped shirt, thus cushioning the fall of the 52, who continued to scream furiously, since the 52nd expectation is that in a few seconds his end will come, and the only one to turn to is God. But all ends well for the 52nd, who finds himself sitting on the ground with a nearby Black Tiger. Seihu orders him to stay where he is, not realizing what just happened to him, and Seihu himself will follow the Great Spirit, since the latter was able to drag away the child, or as the 52nd angel believes. But it seems as if the appeal is like robbing the 52nd of the ground from under his feet, since his suspension means an obvious resignation, and this time, it's much more serious. Meanwhile, the Great Spirit with his prey continues past the dense thickets of the mountain. In doing so, the child still continues to be held captive by the Great Spirit, as long as the Great Spirit's paws do not touch the solid surface of the ground. And that's to make sure they're not being chased, because everyone knows that the black tiger is a monster that eats Donghwa's Sanshin. In addition, the black tiger was once a powerful creature that no one could defeat, not even the Great Spirit. However, even though Seihu Black Tiger, he would never catch up to the Great Spirit on Mount Dorasan, where all preparations will be completed and the Great Spirit will feed the kidnapped child to his children and turn them into Sansan. At the same time, the child himself, while continuing to hang in the teeth of the Great Tiger, does not seem to understand what it is all about. In the meantime, the Great Spirit, once again detached from the earth, continues her journey to Mount Dorasan, where her children are. At the same time, each time covering more and more distance in an effort to get to his lair as quickly as possible. But the black tiger keeps up with the Great Spirit, who is in sight of Seihu chasing him on his heels. And now, the black tiger also reaches the location of the Great Spirit's lair. With that said, all Black Tiger has to do is look around and wait for the right moment to perform. And at this time, the Great Spirit also already reaches its nesting place, continuing to hold the child in its teeth. And after a short while, the child falls down, landing directly on the earthen floor of the cave. And the bloody face of the Great Spirit with its unblinking red gaze begins to loom over the child, who turns her head just in time to meet the gaze of the monster preparing to slay her. But instead of being frightened, the girl notices that the Great Spirit has blood on his head, which means she is hurt. And the Great Spirit has no choice but to change anger into mercy and agree with the child's word, who begins to reach out to the Great Spirit as she feels she is now in great pain. And at that very moment, the girl walks up to the Great Spirit and gives him a hug that begins to soften Sanshin. However, Sanshin picks herself up and tries to become evil again, since this girl's fate has already been decided, and there is nothing she can do about it. And taking a child's life and feeding it to their children for reincarnation is the only way out. But again, to the surprise of the Great Spirit, the child, without unclasping her arms, assures her that all is well. This hurts Sansan, who has just finally decided to take the child's life, even more, as suddenly Seihu's raspy voice regarding the interest of why Sanshins eat human flesh makes her come to her senses. And Seihu, looking at Sanshin's cubs, keeps saying that they are the ones the Great Spirit wants to feed. At the same time, Sansino's cub nestled in Seihu's arm continues to sleep unaware of the danger. But does feeding the cubs human flesh to the Great Spirit make the baby's Sanshin? And seeing that the baby is starting to wake up, Seihu decides to put him back down on the soft bedding of the nest. At the same time, Sanshin, seeing that the black tiger has managed to get to her nest and realizing what will follow, starts screaming. And Seihu had already unleashed his battle weapon and was pointing its tip directly at the lying infant. And what supposedly in Sanshin's mind should happen next makes her gasp in relief. That said, Seihu saying that Sanshins are born rather than made by turning another beast into one promises failure in terms of the Great Spirit, who doesn't want to hear anything because it doesn't apply to everyone, and it's likely that her children are the ones who are different. After all, for 300 years, the Great Spirit has watched her little ones lose their lives, and if there is even the slightest chance to fix it, she will not back down. Besides, Black Tiger himself shares her opinion that there is nothing wrong with a mother taking care of her babies. It's also not at all like predators don't eat animals other than human flesh. However, if the Great Spirit thinks that he can do whatever he wants, the Black Tiger has no choice but to do the same. And it seems that the Great Spirit understands what the Black Tiger is starting to get at. But if the Black Tiger does not release the Great Spirit babies, he has no choice but to take the life of the captive child. However, from Black Tiger's words, he doesn't care what happens to the child and let the Great Spirit do with it as he wishes. And anyway, how could the Great Spirit think of threatening the Black Tiger and trying to manipulate him by way of an ordinary child? But now the Great Spirit's mouth is very close to the head of the child standing there, and the Black Tiger continues to clutch his battle weapon ever tighter in his hands, ready to make an immediate appearance. At the same time, the Great Spirit's gaze does not stop assessing the situation and drills the surrounding people, until eventually the Great Spirit creature begins to get to the bottom of what's going on. And realizing what is going on from Sansan's eyes, tears seep out of her eyes, and the child, wanting to help her in some way, starts stroking the Great Spirit's face, who asks the Black Tiger only one thing: not to touch her children, to which he immediately gets the answer that they are not in his area of interest. Thus a pact is formed between the Great Spirit and the Black Tiger, which Seihu, in the name of Dongye, swears not to break. At the same time, the Black Tiger is not going to take responsibility for the consequences of the battle that will not pass. And then, to everyone's surprise, the Great Spirit's front paws begin to bend in a sign of obedience. Witnessing that the Great Spirit will not resist, but accept her fate, and now the Black Tiger may take her life. And the only thing the Great Spirit does with tear-filled eyes is turn to his children, one of whom, with a distinctive glow in his eyes, seems to be beginning to understand his mother's speech, who takes one last look at them and asks them to live well, but only without her. Just as suddenly, the Black Tiger's battle weapon stabbed into the flesh of the Great Spirit who had fallen so easily before him. In doing so, the Black Tiger itself absorbs Sanshin's soul and her memories along with it, where one of the Great Spirit's little ones lost his life to illness while still in its infancy, and another baby went to heaven through the fault of man, and so another died in the wake. But could the child of Sanshin himself take his life so easily? And if it works out that way, the Great Spirit will do his best to turn all his children into Sansin, even if it would cost her life returning Seiha to the beginning of the convoy's movement to the royal quarters. And now Seihu is sitting on the body of the Sanshin he destroyed, completely immersed in his thoughts from what he just saw. But no matter how much Seihu wants to, nothing can be undone, and all he can do is leave the scene of the final confrontation. As suddenly blocking the Black Tiger's path, a child appears in front of him, forcing Seiha to stop. There is only one question the child wants to know the answer to, and that is why Seihu did this to the Great Spirit. But Seihu does not intend to explain anything, and even less to report to the child, as he thinks that it is not her business. And bypassing the child, Seihu continues on his way, purposefully moving towards the exit of the Great Spirit's lair. And the child, left standing still, decides to turn around and take another look at where Sanshin is lying, whose breathless body begins to be surrounded by sleep-deprived babies calling for their mom. At this, the child turns away from Sanshin, yet decides to look where the Black Tiger is headed. And finally realizing that he's not coming back for her, the child has no choice but to follow him. At that, the child reaches Seihu already far from the entrance to Sanshin's lair down the mountain. But as soon as darkness falls, an unknown man with a torch in his hands views the battlefield between the hunters and the Great Spirit. Among the things worth their attention is an open iron box, but it too is of no interest. And the head of his gang decides that the meeting with the monster from the iron box can cost them their lives. First decides to capture the mercenaries, who, according to the head of the gang, are not far away hiding somewhere nearby, and who must be captured immediately. Meanwhile, Seihu and the baby reach the spot where they left off waiting for the 52nd. Seihu realizes that he's made the 52nd man wait too long, and asks how his wound is, to which he replies in the affirmative. However, that's not all 52 wants to say to his assistant Se as he stares at him, since at this point, their paths must part and the 52nd will go on alone. But apparently this was not the continuation of the conversation Seihu was expecting, as he turned his inquisitive gaze on the 52nd man. However, it is the choice of the 52nd, and what Seihu can only wish him is to be careful on the mountain path. And hearing what Seihu says about meeting the 52nd in the future, the latter decides that these are the words Seihu speaks to all the mercenaries. The 52nd assures Se that he will pretend that on this particular day he saw nothing unusual but what will happen to Miss Angel. But Seihu, ignoring 52's last question, thanks him for not giving up Black Tiger. And the 52nd, realizing that he does not get an answer to his question about the child, turns to clarify, but sees no one around, which, however, does not surprise the 52nd person, who accepts it as something quite normal. After all, in fact, their paths diverge anyway, and the 52nd decides to return to his fellow mercenaries. And, at the same time, two people sitting in the bushes in an ambush start exchanging words about something. And once everything is resolved, they leave their stakeout spot for the 52nd Seihu and the baby at lightning speed. And Seihu, having said goodbye to the 52nd, continues on his intended route. However, and the child following him foot in foot does not want to lag behind the Black Tiger. With that, Seihu's mind whirls with the desire to know when the child will show her true strength. It is only when Se knows the child's name that he can not only take her powers, but eat her. But why is Black Tiger so interested in it? Is it because it's unknown to him? However, the Black Tiger of Seihu's martial arts weapon accurately points out that the latter is in no hurry, but only needs to show the child his brutality. And then just in the midst of Seihu's silent dialogue with the Black Tiger, a child appears in front of him, asking why he took Sanshin's life. But since this time, as well as the previous times, the child does not get an answer from Seihu, the girl repeats her question again. And Seihu, looking at the girl again, gets urged by the Black Tiger to eat her for revenge, which will allow him to gain Sanshin's power and get revenge. After all, is Seihu as naive as the 52nd man, who treats a child as an angel in human form? form. Besides, isn't Seihu hungry enough to be tempted to pounce on a child, who apparently reads Seihu's mind and says he's hungry, confirming his words with a rumbling in his stomach. And at that moment, Seihu realizes that it's time for them to eat, so they need to go to Raewul, where there will be something for that purpose. In the meantime, the 52nd is still continuing on to the place where he and his companions live. Seeing that there is a building in front of him that resembles the place of their deployment, he realizes that he is tired. And besides, the 52nd was late, which explains why he was the only one left alive of the gang. But in reply, except for the howling of the wind, the 52nd receives nothing to his disappointment, as suddenly there is a sound attracting the attention of the 52nd, turning his head at the noise, where he sees one of his comrades standing in the doorway, which means this is where they were. And the 52nd, rejoicing that at last he will meet with like-minded people, admits that although he has been hiding for some time, he has achieved his goal. But then the conversation of the 52nd was interrupted by two armed men who appeared at the entrance to the wicket. At the same time, people dressed differently than the 52nd began to come out of the other doors of the building. With that, an already formed group of other mercenaries slowly begin to surround the 52nd, who clearly notes that although there are many mercenaries, they have not revealed themselves in any way. Suddenly, the train of thought of the 52nd is disturbed by the speech of a man addressing him with only two questions for him. And the first one is whether the 52nd knows where the Iron Box child is now. However, the 52nd is in no hurry to answer and wants to know where his comrades who lived here have gone. But the head of the mercenaries recalls that it was he who first asked the 52nd question. Besides, he wants to know who the elder is. At the same time, 52, trying to evade the answer, says that an elder is someone who is older. Apparently, such a ridiculous answer from the 52nd man puts the head of the mercenaries in a stupor for a split second, which immediately devolves into deafening laughter, with a subtle hint of savvy from the 52nd. And since the 52nd so quipped, he deserves to know the answer first as to his friends who are dead. However, the head of the mercenaries still wants to know the answers to his questions, in exchange for which he gives the 52nd man his life. But it seems to the 52nd man to be deceitful, for the people around him will not let him escape so easily. Besides, the 52nd is already on the line, and with his dagger, he can take away at least one of the mercenaries. And having decided to continue to play the fool, the 52nd wants to verify the words of the head of the mercenaries on condition that he tells everything he knows. And since that's the case, what's the first thing the 52nd should tell the head of the mercenaries, at the same time noticing that one of them was coming at him from behind with his battle weapon drawn. But the 52nd manages to dodge, and the enemy's battle weapon pierces the air, while being wounded by the 52nd, who looks around and realizes that the mercenaries have long since made up their minds about it. And not being able to orient himself in time, the 52nd receives two, through and through, blows from the opponent's battle weapon. At that, the 52nd's strength left him, and he fell to his knees in front of his executioner, who looks down at him and declares that he knew from the beginning that the 52nd would tell him nothing about the elders. At the same time, the head of the mercenaries is approached by a subordinate with a report that a man has brought a girl who looks like Huemori to Raewul. However, the head believes that his subordinate is wrong, because who would just carry Huemori around with him? But the subordinate insists on the truth of his words, because he saw with his own eyes that the man was calm at that moment. To which the head of the mercenaries, strongly doubting his man, decides to see for himself. And the still surviving 52nd remembers Elder Moon Sang-sik's words regarding the trail. And all the 52nd can say, in farewell, is to ask him to forgive him for his mistake and wish good luck to Suhai and the child, which at this very time reaches the site of the village of Raewul. But something along the way starts to catch their attention, forcing them to stop. And most of all, what we see has an impact on the child, who is unwilling to continue on the journey any further, which piques the interest of Seihu, who also notices something amiss. And that something is two pillars with carved human faces and scarves tied around their necks as flag. In doing so, Seihu notices that the child is trying to avoid these pillars by going around them at a considerable distance, which makes Seihu feel as if the child is avoiding them for fear of getting close. Since the girl has already moved a great distance away from Seihu, she doesn't plan to wait for him, but moves farther away each time. And Sei has no choice but to pull his headdress down and follow the child, at the same time trying to convey to the girl that there is nothing to be afraid of because it is just a pathetic piece of wood. But it only seems that way from the outside, because in reality, there is a man behind them who has been stalking Seihu and the child. And the warrior is not going to end there, but continues to look after the travelers to see in which direction they are moving. At the same time, A woman sitting on the doorstep of her establishment resents the fact that since morning, she has no customers, which threatens to ruin her. She was foolish to open a business near Mount Dor, where cannibals are rampant, until Seihu notices, who looks around and starts calling out to anyone who's alive. And immediately the hostess of the establishment rushes out of her seat with all her hospitality to greet the guests. But something makes her stop and widen her eyes in surprise and let out a shriek. And Seihu, not paying any attention to the hostess's reaction, informs her that he wants to place an order for a simple breakfast. However, maternal instinct takes its course, and the owner of the establishment looks in horror at the skinny and dirty child standing next to Seihu. And the first thing the hostess of the establishment wonders is why the child is in such a state, and then rushes to put food in the cup with the thought of starving the child for days. I mean, how is it possible that such a sweet girl could be so emaciated and thin? Which means you have to put as much food as you can and take it to the poor child and her chaperone. And as soon as everything is ready, the hostess immediately places bowls of food in front of the child and Seihu, casting a judgmental glance at the latter, who should be ashamed of the condition of a child who needs to be properly fed. In doing so, the girl receives from the hostess of the establishment not only a bowl overflowing with food, but also a little affection. And Seihu, among other things, is reproached for not being able to take care of his daughter since he starves her and makes her wear dirty clothes. And wanting to justify himself, Seihu doesn't have time to say anything when he sees the child emptying the bowl of food in one fell swoop, which falls noisily to the table, indicating that it no longer contains the long-awaited food. At the same time, the girl emits a sound and stares at Seihu, who has an untouched plate next to her, and Seihu begins to realize what such a gesture from the seemingly still hungry girl means. Which means Sei won't have the conscience to touch his food while the girl is glaring at it. And now Seihu is already starting to push away a full plate of food that he can't even taste. The next thing he does is to move his finger and send the plate of food straight to the child, who immediately grabs it, surprising Seihu, and empties the food bowl in one fell swoop. And all Sei has left to do is turn to the hostess, who approached them to ask for another portion. But then Seihu's gaze shifts to the child, who is staring at him with a judgmental look and an empty plate. And Seihu decides to order 2 portions, which is not surprising according to the hostess since the child is starving. At that, Seihu, trying to switch from the outgoing rumbling in his stomach, wondered one thing, specifically how long whoever's hiding behind the building wall has been following Seihu and the child. At this, the mercenary warrior sitting outside the establishment begins to be plagued by thoughts creeping into his head. As for whether the child in the story is the same Huimori, because the girl looks like a normal child. Suddenly, the mercenary warrior's thoughts are disturbed by a question from behind him, namely, who he is, and this forces the mercenary warrior to quickly orient himself and turn to face the enemy, putting his hand behind his back in search of a weapon, which is Seihu thinking I was just passing through. However, the mercenary warrior doesn't even try to refute this, and without even asking who Seihu is, suggests that he just leave. But such a scenario does not suit Seiha, who is not going to leave even because he has not finished his soup, to which the mercenary warrior tells Seihu to leave, leaving both the soup and the baby behind since he doesn't even know what kind of baby it is. And it's hard to disagree with Seihu because he actually found her on a mountain trail where the child had followed him, which confirms the warrior's guess that this child is a Sanshin named Huimori, who wiped out dozens of villagers in the village of Bijuk. And since these warriors are hunters capable of handling such monsters, Seihu should leave the child to them and go away, which supposedly causes Seihu to be horrified by the horror story told to him. And seeing a kid with spoons in his hands dancing on the table, Seihu decides he'd better run right away. But what does the warrior mean by saying the word "we" doesn't mean that there are others around without seeing the mercenary swinging a weapon at him. However, Seihu manages to react to the mercenary warrior's lunge and dodge the blow in time. Not only that, as Seihu grabs the mercenary warrior by the shoulder, causing him to exclaim, as the mercenary warrior bypasses the wall of the building with all his might and flies in the opposite direction of Seihu, and smashes into the table, causing a deafening noise in the neighborhood. But as soon as the mercenary warrior comes to his senses, rubbing his bruised spot, he doesn't notice the child standing next to him. And as soon as he looks at her, he's not only surprised, but horrified. However, the child watching the mercenary warrior with interest seems to wonder a great deal. The mercenary warrior, trying to defuse the situation by calming the child, says that he was just passing by. But what follows is truly terrifying to the child, for before her gaze appears a man surrounded by mercenaries and a scroll in his hand, and addressing no longer to the girl, but to the monster, the man orders it to sleep upon, awakening from which he will be awaiting a perfect sacrifice. But this is even more beginning to frighten the girl, whose eyes widen with terror. And what What follows leads the mercenary warrior to believe that he has made a mistake somewhere. In addition, what she sees shocks the hostess of the establishment, who can't understand what's going on at all. Oh, and to top it off, Seihu also witnesses what happened while looking at the baby, which at this very moment, having changed and become four-legged, is baring its teeth. At this, in addition to the beastly grin and the scream being emitted, everything around Huimori is covered in ice blocks. And Seihu, seeing the state the child is in now, is trying his best to bring her back to her former state. But it's too late as Huimori pushes off with her four limbs and heads towards Seihu, until it lands right on the roof of the building next to the black tiger. And then the Huimori girl's gaze, full of regret, is directed towards Seihu, who also stares unwaveringly at the terrified child intent on running away. And already the child Huimori is off the ground, and with a strong push, she flies a considerable distance away from her pursuer, who at the same time walks up to Seihu from behind and says that he's the only reason Seihu is still alive. He hides his weapon behind his back and continues to tell Seihu to leave as quickly as possible, leaving him to take care of the monster. And not wanting to delay any longer, the mercenary warrior prepares to strike, thinking that this time Sei won't be so lucky. But to the surprise of the mercenary warrior, speaking stealthily, Seihu speaks only one word twice, which means Seihu doesn't want to waste his power on someone who only attacks from behind. But the mercenary warrior, clutching his battle weapon even tighter in his hands, doesn't understand what Seihu is even talking about right now, who at the very moment the mercenary warrior is about to swing at him, continues to stand with his back to his opponent. But this scene is witnessed by the hostess of the establishment, who can't find the right words to express her horror. As at this very moment, the mercenary warrior, who just had a winning position now, with a dagger in his head, falls in front of Seihu. He did not understand how this could happen to him so quickly, and Seihu thinks he's not done, since he wants to ask the mercenary warrior who he is. But seeing that the mercenary warrior was already falling to the ground, Seihu realized it was too late to ask any question. In addition, Seihu notices the state of the hostess who witnessed the scene and the horror on her face. At the same time, the hostess of the establishment does not even realize what exactly she has to answer to Sei's rather simple question about her condition. And Seihu decides to leave the money to compensate not only the table, but also the clients she loses because of him, while asking for forgiveness. And in case the rest of the mercenary warrior's men show up, the hostess should go to headquarters and tell them what she saw. And Seihu would also be very grateful to the hostess if she spread the news that there were no more ogres on Mat Door. Thus, Seihu leaves the establishment, leaving the hostess alone with her thoughts, amongst which the hostess of the establishment flashes a glimpse of what Seihu was saying regarding cannibals and their current absence. And in general, the owner of the establishment needs to do what she was told to do as soon as possible, despite the fact that a man's life was taken in her establishment. Meanwhile, Seihu continues to move on the trail of Huimori's child, in parallel with the Black Tiger's energy orientation, while noting that the closer Sanshin's power is, the stronger the Black Tiger energy that comes out of the battle weapon. And once the energy released by Seihu's martial weapon twisted his entire body, he would turn into a Black Tiger, which catches up with the child Huimori, who at this very moment is in his transformation hiding behind a tree. And everything around us, including the leaves of the trees, starts to be covered with ice enveloping all living things, which turned into ice creams falling straight down from the trees with pegs. And the Black Tiger, being filled with energy, turns to Sei, saying that in front of him is a pure and strong energy that is incomparable to anything. But if that's the case, then what's Seihu waiting for? Is he waiting for Huimori's baby to show its power? And Seihu, already at the mercy of the Black Tiger, unleashes his battle weapon, pointing it directly at the child Huimori trying to eat him. But what a surprise it is for Seihu to see what Huimori's baby is trying to do, who tearfully tries to bite Seiya's hand with all her might. Meanwhile, Black Tiger once again pits Seiya against Huimori's baby, thinking he's showing sympathy based on the fact that it's a child. But that's not the point. It's that the baby doesn't have a name, and as soon as she gets one, she can settle down. And besides, the Black Tiger is still hungry after the previous sacrifice, and the child will be able to gain even more power after receiving the name. Meanwhile, Huimori, having abandoned her attempts to hurt Sel, sobs and cries, announces that she's not going anywhere, since the girl Huimori no longer wants to be locked in an iron box again, which is not just solidly locked, but covered in a multitude of magical seals. And finding the girl Huimori inside it causes genuine fear, as the child really dislikes being in the dark, and Seihu puts his child-bitten hand forward and notices the Black Tiger's energy starting to fade away. And instead of continuing to act on Black Tiger's nudges, Seihu reached out to the girl and rubbed her head, and then he pulls the child to him and hugs her, trying to reassure her that she doesn't have to go anywhere because he will take her home. But that place will be where the girl Huimori can find a name for herself, and then she'll be finished. At the same time, the people hunting for Huimori arrive at the establishment near the village of Dore, and their head, seeing the body, orders it to be burned. And besides, we need to get this place cleaned up before the Mokchan people come to stare, and then we have to go in pursuit. But no one knows in which direction Seihu and the baby went, as there is hardly any trace of them. However, if Seihu is still with Huimori, then the mercenary warriors at least know what direction they are heading in, and their landmarks are the mountain peaks located to the east of the mercenary warriors, some of whom, led by their commander, decide to move forward. Meanwhile, Seihu and her child, Huimori, are near a small house whose owner is very angry that they are heading uphill, which is not good, but if it is decided by them, Seihu and the baby can stay overnight in the house provided by the hostess, to which Seihu has to refuse since the hostess has already done a lot for them by delivering, among other things, children's clothes. The child Huimori immediately transforms into by parting with her filthy rag, which elicits a shout of joy from the hostess who, though she was wrong about the size, is grateful to Sei for reminding her how hands should move. So, is Seihu a healer? To which the latter, looking at what Yamavori is doing, gives an ambiguous answer. The hostess is surprised to see that Seihu's bundle is filled with herbs and medicine, but Seihu replies that it's all for emergencies that might happen on the road. And what the landlady thinks that Seihu and the baby are going to Kangsong to take the healer's exam, there is also wrong. The hostess compliments Huimori and wants to know what her name is, and when she hears Seihu call her Nikchamesh, she is outraged. But he decides that he will not pester them with questions and excuses, only warns them not to stay in an abandoned house in the mountains, which sparks some interest in Seihu counting his inventory after the child's intervention. To which the landlady says that every night a spirit appears in the abandoned house, which is an embittered daughter-in-law who destroyed the whole family to this day, hunts travelers. But this is just an unverified rumor. And sometime later, Seihu and her child, standing near the house, notes that not even a year has passed, and the house is almost collapsed. However, we need to check who Sanshin's ghost is hiding in it, or if it's just a delusional rumor. After noticing a well near the house, Seihu decides to take a sip of water first to quench his thirst. So, Seihu leaves the baby and heads to the well to see if there is water in it. Seeing that the well is not empty, Seihu first decides to see if the water is usable. But before getting water, Seihu, turning to the child with his back turned to him, first ate. However, Seihu is very embarrassed by this treatment, and to avoid misunderstandings, he thinks that the child should be given a name. Meanwhile, the child Huimori is leaning over something with a quick hand, which piques Seihu's interest somewhat, then brings him out of his many thoughts. Because at that very moment, Seihu turns the child to face him and notices that the girl is chewing something. And then Seihu's gaze dropped to the leaves that served as plates, where food had recently been set out for both of them. With that, all Sei is left to do is sadly contemplate the empty leaves while the child heads for the well with all her legs. Once again, memories begin to take over Seiha regarding the child's home, where there is a lot of snow and the wind is constantly blowing. Also, Seihu tries to recognize the girl, who must have been named something, but she doesn't remember anything, but only remembers that it came from where the mountains rise, namely from the east, and where there is a forested valley and strong wind and heavy snow, namely the place called Mount Huinimi, which is enough for Seihu, who thinks it's quite informative, and it's also clear that the girl doesn't have to be called by name. However, that's what Seihu thought at first, but never suspected that he would later puzzle over the baby's name. After all, Sei was just curious to know who the child was, and it was only clear that she could eat once she had emptied 2 plates. Also, Seihu notes that Huimori's child can use the well, which could mean that she lived near the village. But then the child notices Huimori's gaze stops on someone, causing her to stop trying to pull the bucket out. For at this very moment, the spirit of a woman appears from the well, attracting the child to her. At the same time, the dead woman's hands clench the cheeks of the still impressed girl with all their might. And all the spirit of a woman who keeps holding her baby is to call her hubby, which is not to the liking of the child Huimori, who frees herself from the dead embrace and punches the spirit in the face. And trying to shove the woman's spirit back into the well, the girl says with all her might that she's not going anywhere. But the child does not succeed, and already the spirit of the woman in full growth begins to appear from the well. The spirit of the woman, putting forward her clawed hands, begins to crawl on the child, with a call to go with her. However, no matter how hard the woman tries to take the child with her to the bottom of the dark waters, the girl again repeats that she will not go anywhere. As the child, Huimori, despite the persistent entreaties of the spirit, woman reports that the darkness is not to her liking. But the spirit of the woman does not give up and keeps repeating for the child to go with her, until Seihu's battle weapon overtakes the woman's spirit, piercing her flesh. That said, Seihu realizes that he doesn't like to consume ghosts together with their memories and the bitter moments of their lives, since ghosts don't add strength like the Sansins, but their memories only cause pain. But ghost rumors are often directly related to the Sanshins, and it is for this reason that Seihu is quick to respond to them. However, Seihu is not interested in ghost hunting, since all he cares about is the Sanshins. Meanwhile, the child Huimori flips over the side of the well and peers into the waters within, to which Seihu tells the child not to dare to drink it, but to go further and try to find the stream. And then Sei starts to come up with an idea that seems very good to him. And looking into the eyes of the girl staring at Seihu, Black Tiger utters the word "sorry," which is of genuine interest to the child Huimori, who does not understand the meaning of the word. And Seihu explains that sorry, translated as frost, is very suitable for the girl, as it reminds him of her strength. And it's quite possible that sorry isn't like the baby's real name, but for now, you can call the girl that. She keeps repeating it all the way to the creek, and Seihu, thinking she doesn't like it, decides to call her name Han Seihi. But hearing from a child that she likes the name, Seihu wonders if Sori is hungry or not, to which he gets a negative response from the girl who repeats the name Seihi just told her. In front of Seihi and Sori stretches the third largest river in Donghua, so fast and deep that it is easier to drown in it. And that's where Seihi thinks Sori pushed his bundle, but as it turns out Sori didn't push it, she threw it. At the same time, Seihi, hearing such a frank confession from the child, asks to point out the place where the knot flew away, to which Sori doesn't even turn his head or look at Seihi, pointing his finger at nothing, which doesn't go unnoticed by Seihi, who wonders why Sori is looking away when he points to a spot. At the same time, Seihi himself, remembering what was in the knot, estimates the loss of clothes, needles, threads, money, and food to date. In addition, a salve of healing herbs and a needle box complete the list of irreplaceable losses. And as it turns out, it wasn't the turtle that caused Sori to throw the bundle in the river, which Sori tried to catch, but the turtle managed to dodge her and swim away. That absolutely does not understand Seihi, and is eager for the story to continue about the loss of his knot and the turtle's guilt. However, there is no way to get the bundle, as they cannot cross the river, and they are not familiar with the area. And an hour earlier, standing next to the boat, a man offers it to Sei and Sori to cross the river. And the man waving his fan has a desire to explain Seihi and Sori, but it would take too long. But still the person makes the attempt, and asks the question of whether or not they want to hear the story. And caught off guard, Sei has no choice but to agree and ask the man to tell. In this case, the old man for clarity opens his fan and begins the story with the fact that everything happened 3 years ago, when for unknown reasons the fish in the river suddenly stopped pecking, and on the way back, the boat got a hole through which the water flowed. The local shaman ordered a human sacrifice to appease Sanshin, but there was nothing the people could do about it. And it is at this misfortune that the old man's story is interrupted, leaving Sori in anticipation of waiting and not touching Seiya's feelings one bit, who realizes that there's no way to cross the river on this boat without oars and with a hole in it. The old man tells them to move to the upper river, where it narrows, and where there are probably still some boats left. And now Sori, still regretting the lost knot, cites the turtle's guilt. However, Seihi is getting tired of this and asks him to stop talking about the turtle and draws Sori behind him. But Seihi still wonders for what purpose Sori, who assures him of the truth of her words, was going to catch the turtle. Sori doesn't hesitate to look into Seiya's eyes and replies that she wanted to ride a turtle. But if that's the case, was the turtle really big enough to carry Sori? However, Sori says that the turtle was small, and since that's the case, the idea of riding on it will not come true. And hearing from Sori that this turtle would have stood her up, Seihi wonders where she found such a big turtle, to which Sori, pointing her finger in the opposite direction from them, is informed of her last location. And Seihi, following Sori's finger pointing in the direction, hears her let out a cheer, because up to now, a man with a head like a turtle hides behind the stone and sees that he is noticed. But not a minute later, the turtle disappears and Sori, turning to Seihi, exclaims that it was a turtle. At that, Seiha's gaze also catches something that resembles a turtle, so is it really a Sanshin? And since that's the case, Seihu takes up his battle weapon and decides to check it out for himself. However, before he can take a full step, Seihi stops as his feet get stuck in something unpleasant. And this something is either mud or swamp slurry, in which the feet almost drown up to the ankles. With Seihi trying to shake off the mud, he realizes there's no running around these parts. And besides, Sanshin can easily hide in the reeds, so there's a good chance Seihi won't catch it. Suddenly, Sori, who thinks Seihi wants to ride her too, offers her help in catching the turtle. But how can you trust Sori if she drowned Seihi's bundle last time? But that was in the water, and now we're talking about dry land. And this tempting offer coming from Sori makes Seihi think twice. But since Seihi has no other options for catching Sanshin, he agrees to let Sori take matters into her own hands. And now Sori, having switched to running on all fours, is easily overcoming the seemingly difficult road. And that's because Sori got permission from Seiha to catch her target. At the same time, Seihi, seeing the speed at which Sori is running on 4 legs, notes the speed that exceeds that of a marten. And Sori keeps going on and on, covering the distance, gaining considerable speed, until eventually it switches to jumping exactly where the turtle is hiding from prying eyes. Seihi can't believe his ears when he hears that Sori manages to catch the fugitive turtle. At this, Seihi hears Sori ordering the turtle to stop spinning, to which the turtle pleads for help. And deciding that Sori is taking the life of a turtle that won't stop screaming, he also heads to the scene of their confrontation. However, the matter is complicated by the fact that there is mud all over the neighborhood, and Seihi has to choose a place where it will be cleaner. But hearing the turtle screaming exhaustedly, Seihi drops everything and moves towards the place, hoping that Sori didn't destroy Sanshin before it consumed him. However, what Seiho sees as the turtle screams for help as she thinks she's being robbed of her life makes Seiya stop, and then to regret that he might have thought something like Sori was capable of destroying her own kind. In fact, Seihi should explain to Sori that she shouldn't take everyone's life. However, the Sanshin before Seihi surprises him with his appearance and the shape of his upper and lower limbs. Sori, meanwhile, had already put her foot on Sanshin's turtle's head and was crushing it into the dirt. He ignores the turtle's pitiful cry and orders it to lie still and not to move. Seihi can't understand where such weaklings come from. Even a well ghost would be stronger. However, it should not be underestimated, because even from such at least some benefit will be. But something changes in Seiha's plans, and he hides his battle weapon back in its sheath. And turning to Sori suggests that she listen to Sanshin's turtle first, since Seihi will always have time to devour him. In fact, those Sanshin that dwell in high mountains and powerful rivers are stronger, but there are exceptions among them. And apparently, the river where the turtle-like Sanshin is found is becoming the exception. Since even Sori, who is sitting on top of Sanshin without any strength, handles him and orders him to go swimming, while this same Sanshin tirelessly continues to shout for help as he believes that he is about to be robbed of his life. And seeing that no help will be given to him, the turtle has no choice but to surrender to fate, which is very interesting to Seihi since this behavior is not typical of the Sanshin he's met. The turtle continues to lie face down in the mud and ceases to show any signs of life. And so, Sori sitting on it decides that the turtle can't take the onslaught and has already taken her life. The turtle suddenly jumped up and moved forward with all its might, knocking Sori over, which was unsupported and fell off the turtle's shell into the mud while the turtle was grabbing a stick. And now standing on 2 legs with a stick in his hands, the turtle prepares to strike, citing the fact that Sori manages to piss him off, which brings some interest and a kind of surprise to Seihi, who observes this picture. That said, it seems that Sori, who continues to sit, also does not expect such an unexpected, seemingly harmless turtle. And the turtle, filled with anger, is already swinging at Sori, which does not have time to react in time, and gets a paddle right in the forehead, shrieking in surprise. With that, Turtle feels like he's in a winning position from being able to hype Sori up and decides to take the leg kick. But Sori, seeing that the turtle is organizing a speed race, is not going to give up, so quickly accepts the challenge. And besides, Sori is unlikely to catch up to a turtle in water, where the latter has a significant advantage. However, no matter how hard the turtle tries, Sori doesn't even make enough effort to catch up to her, just walks alongside, which causes genuine shock to the turtle, who notices that she can't get away from the girl, walking peacefully beside her. And that makes the turtle even angrier, who decides to resort to a technique she didn't want to use. For which the turtle, adopting the appropriate pose, releases a fountain of water from its mouth that hits Sori directly. And it is not just a blow, but a jet of water, which with great force is directed at the child, which even this time does not have time to react, and with a cry of defeat receives a blow from the turtle. And so, the turtle, once again on 2 legs, and seeing that the water is very close, again organizes a race for speed, as he suddenly sees his path blocked by a pair of men's legs, which raises some questions for him. And looking up from below, the turtle sees Seihi towering over him, holding his battle weapon at the ready, which means the turtle needs to repeat his move in preparation for another spit. But his plans are not destined to come true, because at that very moment, the hilt of a battle weapon is put to his throat. And since the turtle has nothing to do but swallow the spit, it can't withstand the pressure and sneezes violently. At this, Sei begins to look around and notices that a huge number of paddles are piled to one side. And if you look back, there are fences built on the river from logs that are pointed logs. And then it starts to dawn on Seihu that he's facing a Sanshin named Concharu, but if that's the case, what's he doing here? Seeing the state Seihi's turtle is in, he doesn't rush to give him an answer as to how he knows him. And also Sori, who witnesses it and wipes the water off her face, wants to hear the sequel. But once the turtle learns that the black tiger is now standing in front of him, he is savagely terrified, as he clearly does not expect to meet in these parts the black tiger, who has clearly come for his soul. And fear grips the turtle so tightly that he can no longer stand and falls on his butt, causing Seihu to question him. And besides, the turtle can't hold back his tears because he thinks that this time the black tiger has come to devour him. And to soften the black tiger, the turtle stands up on his hind legs and dances to strange sounds, surprising Sori, which obviously doesn't please Seihi, who wants to know what Concharu is up to and where all those paddles and fence-like things came from. However, Concharu, unable to find anything to say to the black tiger, merely refers to the circumstances, thereby angering Seihu, who can't take it anymore, and raises his voice and demands an immediate answer from Concharu, who immediately falls to his knees in front of him. But pulling himself together, Concharu decides to rise to the occasion, and begins by saying that, because of the rapid speed of his answer, he begins to stutter, which pisses off Seihi even more, who thinks Conchar would be better off getting rid of the hiccups in this situation. But as it turns out, Concharu's stuttering problem is related to a certain hangnail, and hearing that Black Tiger does not know this name, Concharu clarifies that Burr is a Sanshin who is widely known in this bay. Seihi is surprised, however, because he knows all the Sanshin in the Donghei lands, but this is the first time he's heard this name, which is very much not surprising to Concharu since this name Sanshinu was coined by him, and it's starting to piss off Seihi, who can barely keep it together. And Concharu, seeing that what he said made Mr. Black Tiger angrier than before, was now sure that he would not escape. However, for now, the Black Tiger has no plans to eat Concharu, and besides, his story has helped Seihi a lot, which gives some chance of salvation to Conchar, who can't believe what he's just heard. But Seihi isn't going to stop there, and still demands an answer as to who Burr is and what Concharu is doing here. To which Concharu tearfully asks to put the answer in a song as it will be faster from his point of view. And already preparing to begin his performance, Concharu wants to know which motif Seihu prefers, Chanjin Mori or Chunchun Mori. Or maybe Mr. Black Tiger wants to hear Hui Mori, then completely messes with Seihai's head, who decides to get rid of Concharu as soon as possible and opts for the Hui Mori genre, which is immediately intercepted by Conchar, who picks up on a certain attitude and decides to start with what a badass BTE looks like, which has a black skin, sharp teeth, and a long mouth, and also spurs on the tail is exterminating all living things, and is already hunting people. And this tune is picked up by Sori, who surprises Seihi with her shout, not expecting a vile foul to be heard from a child. At this, Concharu, seeing the excited state, Sori is in, and her glowing eyes suggests her to join in, to hum. And already Concharu, along with Sori to the movements and tune of the turtles, start dancing joyfully, shouting curses, which doesn't suit Seihi at all, who can barely contain himself from devouring Conchara and ending things there. And Concharu, already on a rampage of undisguised pleasure with Sori, continues to hum, inviting her to have fun. But that doesn't suit Seihi, who looms over Concharu and tells him to end this light show. And back to Concharu's shenanigans, Seihu wants to know if the holes in the boats and stolen oars are really his doing, which doesn't negate Concharu at all, since otherwise people would fall into the clutches of the Saosurens. Seihu wants to know when it all started, to which Concharu replies that it's been 3 years since then, and he was just a simple beast then. However, Seihu thinks it's hard to judge from one story, and needs to find this mystical Burr himself. Concharu replies that this way Seihi will bring trouble on himself, since the Burr is not even afraid of the Black Tiger himself. But Seihi is even better, and Concharu, realizing that it's useless to dissuade him, says that Sasune is somewhere in the river. Suddenly, Concharu notices him, and with all his might, notifies Seihi and Sori, standing not far away from him. However, it seems that the Burr is not making the proper impression on Seihi, expecting more from him, since he only sees the head of the Burr, which is a crocodile peeking out from under the water, and it seems that the burr also notices the people watching him, as he also stares at them. Seihi concludes that the burr is a small log, which Kanchuru disagrees with, since his body is much larger underwater. And since that's the case, Seihi decides that he needs to get as close to the burr as possible, and begins to strip off his clothes. And seeing this, all Kanchuru can say in response is to wish Seihi to be extremely careful. But that's not all, as Seihu wants Koncharu to be the one to drop him off at the south shore, just by simply swimming up to him, which causes unconcealed fear in Koncharu, who can't believe his ears that he has to do anything about it. And all Konchar has to do is hopelessly face down in the mud, which makes Sori interested. After all, Koncharu realizes that if he swims to meet the crouch, it's a straight path to losing his life. And ordering Konchar to get up, Seihi begins to recall hearing about a swamp beast that looks like a giant lizard. Meanwhile, the fisherman spending time in his boat resents his fate and time wasted for nothing for what he will get from his wife. He didn't even notice that a group of mercenaries were already standing near him, and their leader was asking about the cost of the crossing. The boatman immediately replies that the boat is not in motion because there are no oars, and the head of the mercenaries concludes that in these places all boatmen are useless, since in the lower river, the boat is also with a breach. And instead of offering an alternative, the boatman wants to sing the guest a sailor's song, to which the latter responds with a flat refusal. At the same time, we decided that we should go to the upper reaches of the river, because such a big river will surely have at least one fishing boat. But that's not all that interests the head of the mercenaries, who wants to know if the fisherman has seen a man with a girl in rag. The fisherman, after a long thought, replies that the guy and the girl did not fall on his eyes, and the old man's memory has nothing to do with it, because for obvious reasons no one has been visiting these parts for a long time, which obviously doesn't satisfy the head of the mercenaries, who believes the fisherman is deceiving him. And having decided that he will get nothing more out of the fisherman, the head with his gang is about to leave except for one, staring intently at the old man. And the old man, realizing that there will be no more conversation with them, only looks pityingly at those who are leaving, at the same time starting to cry out in a loud voice that, because of the lack of catch, his poor wife and poor children will have nothing to eat. Suddenly, one of the mercenaries approached the fisherman from behind and grabbed the old man by the neck with all his might, because he thinks that the old man has deceived them, and repeats his question whether the boy and the girl have passed here or not. And the old man, feeling the knife blade against him, not wanting to lose his life, immediately replies that he saw Seiha and Sori. But this is not enough for the mercenary, as he wonders when it was, and again, the old man admits that it was half an hour ago. The mercenary is already putting the knife to the old man's neck, because the latter, despite his pleas for mercy, should have said it much earlier. Suddenly, a crowd of men like the fisherman Taysan appeared on the horizon, informing him that there was no bite and offering him a drink of makgeolli. And such a sudden appearance of witnesses causes confusion in the mercenaries' further actions, who turns to the head of the gang and wants to know what to do next, and gets the answer to retreat. And the mercenary, obeying the order of his boss, throws the old man to the ground, who falls to the ground on his back. At the same time, the mercenary warns the fisherman to keep his mouth shut if he doesn't want to lose his life and bring his buddies with him. And so, a group of mercenaries set off on the trail of Seihu and Sori, thinking that the latter are in no hurry to catch up with them so easily. However, it is worth keeping in mind who is in the waters of this river, and what the boss's right-hand man fears. But this is already known to the mercenary boss, who doesn't seem to express much excitement about the monster, because he thinks that to avoid trouble, you just don't want to get close to the river. Meanwhile, Kanchuru, already in the river, still doesn't understand why he should escort the black tiger to Sasen. But instead of answering, he gets hit on the head by Seihu with the hilt of his battle weapon, because the black tiger thinks Kancharu talks too much. After all, only when Sei knows who he's dealing with will he be able to deal with the BTE and promise that Kanchuru will stay alive. But then Seihi's attention turns to Sori, who is standing on the shore, calling his name. And the reason is that Sori wants to take her along since she wants to ride the Kanchara too. However, in Seiha's opinion, it wouldn't be safe for Sori, and all she has to do is wait for them on the shore and keep an eye on the sheath, which clearly does not please Sori, who pushes away the scabbard entrusted to her in anger and indignation. And then the words of the deeds of the vile bastard begin to reach the ears of Seiha sitting on Kanchuru, and the spicy rice balls that the infuriated Sori keeps shouting at what Kanchuru concludes are swear words. At the same time, Seihi can barely contain himself and concludes that this is what Sori Kanchuru taught him, but there's nothing he can do about it, and he can't undo what he's done. However, Concher wonders if the black tiger will really spare him if the turtle gives him help, to which Seihi confidently informs him that he'd rather consume 1 burr than 100 like Concheru, thus reassuring him. And as he continues to hear Sori cursing, Concheru is finally convinced that Seiha's words are right, since the last black tiger didn't eat him either, which can't go unnoticed by Seihi writing Concheru. And hearing about Seihi's past black tiger makes one want to know if the Concharu has met the past black tiger. Concheru happily prepares to give an answer, but since the story is short, he will perform it in Chunmori style. However, because the burr is very close, Seihi decides to postpone the story for another time. With that, the burr, who is actually already within sight, heads towards his enemies. And Seihi, despite Concheru's sobs, decides it's time to take a look at the creep. In doing so, the burr gets closer and closer to Conchar and Seihi each time, who as well as his opponent burr does not even think of retreating and is already preparing to strike by taking the appropriate posture. And so, the assessing gaze of the Saucerens sinks into Conchara, and Seihi seems to be thinking through the next steps. And Seihi, seeing that Sausuren stops, decides to ask him who Sausuren is and what such a beast is doing in the waters of Donghae. Concharu, who has also made attempts to talk to Sanshin, doubts that Sanshin is in front of them, since he has never received a response. And the most likely reason is that Saucin just doesn't understand their speech, but that doesn't mean he's not Sanshin. Also, if the energy emanating from Seiha's battle weapon is to be believed, then the burr is also notable for its outstanding strength. And besides, as Seihi thinks to himself, his name is not even close, unlike Sori. But it's the eyes of burr that speak for everything. They don't just stare, they start to calculate something. And in order to understand Saucin's reaction, Seihi asks Concharu to swim even closer to the beast, which brings fear and tears to the eyes of Concharu, who realizes that if it is not the black tiger that takes his life, it will be the hangnail. All Conchar has to do is trust in fate and follow the black tiger's orders. At the same time, Seihi sees the burr take a fighting stance and concludes that the beast is more honest than it looks, as it makes it clear that it is going to attack. Still, the burr, seeing that Seihi doesn't try to hesitate, decides to take action. In doing so, the first thing the burr does is disappear into the waters of the Dona River. And Concharu, seeing this, decides that the burr is thus escaping, which is not surprising since the black tiger himself is in front of him. But this opinion turns out to be wrong, because the burr has only just gone underwater and therefore needs to stop moving. Concharu, hearing what Seihi is saying, decides to scout the situation with his own eyes and dives his head into the water. And what he has to see is the jaws of a crocodile moving at great speed towards Seihi and Concharu, who, sensing danger and trying to dodge the attack, begins to maneuver, forgetting the black tiger's instructions. And the black tiger, realizing that at this point he is starting to slip off the turtle shell, resents that Concharu disregarded his word. And at that very moment, the burr appears out of the water with a splash, appearing before Seihi in its entirety. At the same time, Concharu, having lost his bearings and squeezing his eyes shut from the shockwave, begins to fall downward. Seihi decides that, even though he's at a disadvantage, he can still hit the Saurus without difficulty. That Seihi successfully pulls it off and lands a combat weapon strike to the side of Saucin's head. With that, Concharu flies aside with a shriek and a splash from the great force of the surge formed by the beast. But Seihi himself sinks underwater, believing that because Concharu started to move, his blow was weaker than expected. However, it's not Concharu's fault, but from now on, Seiha will not be able to use it as a platform. And appearing above the water to Seiha's surprise, he doesn't see Sanshin, who shouldn't just swim away, as suddenly he hears a familiar voice Concharu, who inquires about Seiha's condition, who does not have time to reply. Because at that very moment he notices that very same caster behind the unsuspecting Concharu's back, but it's too late. And Concharu has only time to look back to see the burr's mouth hanging over him. And already the teeth of the burr are beginning to sink into the shell of Concharu, who tearfully asks for help from Mr. Black Tiger. But Concharu doesn't have time to say anything, because the BTE has already clenched its jaws, and together with Concharu sinks into the depths of the waters of the Dona River. At this, the hangnail, like all crocodiles, begins to twist its victim, screaming for help. And Seihi, looking at the scene of the attack on Conchara, begins to realize that Saussure decides to start with easy prey first. Suddenly, Seiha's eyes notice the burr, and he reacts in time to strike with his battle weapon, which turns out to be the right decision on Seiha's part, as his battle weapon reaches its target. And out of the water appears the visible part of the Saussure, still holding Concharu captive. He jumps out of the open mouth of Burr's head, which is then struck by another blow from Seiha. And Kanchuru, not wanting to notice what's going on downstairs, decides that his death is coming, which means everything he's fought for has been for nothing. And with all his might, Kanchuru falls into the water, saying goodbye to life and the ability to row. In the meantime, Sashur continues to be on the surface of the water, unwilling to concede anything to Seihi. At that, the look in Burr's eyes indicates that he is clearly beginning to calculate his next action. Meanwhile, Seihi, having dived into the water, realizes that his business is not good to say the least, and there is no way to catch Saosin without support. Suddenly, Seihi, still underwater, notices with his side vision how the Burr is coming at him, who, even though Seiha has his battle weapon at the ready, doesn't even try to stop. That said, Seihi, knowing that combat weapons don't scare the caster, still doesn't think he has no equal in the water. In the meantime, the Burr is already open-mouthed and ready to strike. And that's what turns out to be needed by Seihi, who also lays his battle weapon out to face the Burr. In doing so, the blow hits the very same Burr that is attacking Seiha's battle weapon. And so, Seihi emerges from this battle victorious, and the Burr is defeated. Because the impact is so strong that it throws Saosin up a considerable height and away from Seiha. And witnessing all this action is Sori, who doesn't quite know how it ends. At that, all Sori can utter is a sign of admiration and amazement at what he has seen. Just as suddenly, Sori's attention is diverted to a foreign sound, causing her to look away from the Burr. And that sound coming from the approaching people is starting to scare Sori. As she leaves Seihi behind, she runs as far away from their place as she can. Seiki, having surfaced again, doesn't understand where the Burr is going again, even though he was aiming at the mouth, but still the blade doesn't take him. But Seihi also remembers Kanchuru thinking that he is already in heaven, and it was a bad idea to take him along. Seihi was already tired enough to go into the water without clothes, but suddenly Seihi notices that Sori is missing. Suddenly, Seihi hears someone call him out in a rude manner. And then Seihi sees that the one who calls him is the boss of the mercenaries who have arrived at the riverbank, and this boss orders him to come out. And the way the mercenary boss says it is that he has a conversation with Seihi. And so, from the word of the mercenary boss, Seiha needs to go out to them to answer a couple of questions they're interested in. But Seihi realizes that these men are in league with the one at the inn, which means they are following Seihi and Sori on their heels. That being said, it's also clear to Seihi that he can't stay in the water without knowing where the monster is, and can't leave without Sori, and thus can enter the battle. However, this may be reckless as Seihi doesn't know what these men are capable of and decides to scout the situation out. Meanwhile, the mercenary boss watches Seihi make his way to dry land and turns to his assistant Chilson, which is to do as soon as Seihi shows up, rendering him unconscious while keeping him alive. Seihi comes ashore, determined to find out what the mercenary boss wants to talk to him about. At this, the mercenary boss jokingly notes that Seihi looks funny in the water with his sword and clothes on, wondering what he's doing there. But apparently that's not what Seihi expects to hear, and if that's all it is, he'll go back into the water. However, the mercenary boss doesn't expect such an answer, and to smooth things over, he replies that the question was rhetorical. And deciding it's no longer worth the delay, the mercenary boss wants to know where Seihi is hiding Huimori, to which Seihi replies that they'd better look into shamanic rituals, since Seihi has nothing to do with the case. But the mercenary boss is unwilling to back down and asks about what it might be the Elder's orders. And then between the boss and Seihi begins a verbal altercation that is not reduced to getting what he wants, and the boss turns to Chilson, who has to show Mr. Seihi their documents, which arouses the latter's undisguised interest. And already Chilson, following his boss's instructions, holds out the documents for Seihi to read. However, Seihi is in no hurry to fulfill the request and wants to know what's in the document first. But instead of answering, Seihi gets a crumpled piece of paper from Chilson right in the face. And the next thing Chilson does is set up to strike at Seihi, who ducks just in time, causing a bit of confusion there for Chilson, who just missed. Meanwhile, Seihi is behind Chilson, already preparing his battle weapons to strike back. At this, the boss, seeing that Chilson is unable to fulfill his instructions, asks him not to be ceremonious, or else he will turn to someone else. But it seems to hurt Chilson's pride, who realizes it's not a fight and decides to take care of it himself. And Seihi, seeing that confidence in Chilson, who meets a worthy adversary, does not smack of pondering further action. Chilson, having been authorized by his boss to do whatever he wants to Seihi, is already swinging his weapon at him. And the next thing Chilson does is throw a punch at Seihi standing in front of him, who is equally successful in deflecting another onslaught from his opponent Chilson, who once again attempts an attack on Seihi by cleaving the air with his weapon, which further stuns Chilson, who doesn't realize when Seiki manages to bounce away from him. In the meantime, Seihi realizes that he can still manage without the tiger's power, but he can't overpower the entire crowd. At the same time, Chilson, already in a frenzy, notes in Seihi an exemplary opponent and does not want to give up, not noticing that the burr is sneaking up from behind. But it becomes clearly visible to the mercenary boss, who, trying to save the Chilsons with all his might, warns him. However, it is too late for Chilson, as at that very moment, the burr looms over him and opens its jaws. And already Chilson is trapped in the jaws of burr, dragging Chilson into the water. And then comes the turn of actions peculiar to all crocodiles, which, rotating in a spiral, leave the victim no chance. Which clearly shocks the mercenary boss, who didn't expect such a drastic turn of events, where he loses his man in a matter of seconds. Seihi realizes that because the burr was hiding his presence, Seihi could have been hurt. But what can he do now? Since in case of an attack on Sazan, strangers will see the Black Tiger's power, which is very undesirable for Seiha, who notices that the burr, having eaten Chilson something, says something, but it is impossible to make out. But you can only guess. And Seihi, realizing that he has no way out, hopes that the mercenaries will mistake him for a dark spellcast. At the same time, Seihi decides to take action and calls the monster on himself because he thinks he has a better chance of winning on land. But no matter how hard Seihi tries, the burr bypasses him and heads in the other direction, causing Seihi to wonder. Meanwhile, Sassanetz heads over to where the mercenary boss is standing with his subordinates, to which Seihi deduces that the burr decides to start with a light appetizer, which confirms his narrow-mindedness despite the kit. At this, the mercenary boss, noticing that he is the next victim, pulls out a red scrap of cloth, which he points in the direction of the burr's mouth, ordering it to stay away. And it seems to be working, for which the mercenary boss decides to avert his eyes to scout the situation. It seems that the boss's move works because the burr is still standing nearby, but does not attempt to attack. Meanwhile, the mercenary boss is pulling forward a red flap, trying to convey to Sassan that they are not rivals. At the same time, what burr sees when he looks at the people are frightened faces with red scraps stretched forward. And in addition to the mercenary boss, two more of his subordinates, repeating after their boss and no less afraid of the Soshur, pulled forward red shred. And the mercenary boss, realizing that his plan is working, sees the burr bypass him and keep moving. Much to Seihi's surprise, who concludes that the burr is not only strange, but also behaves strangely, which only plays into the hands of the mercenary boss, who, seeing that Sazanetz is moving on Seihi, hopes that the latter will be devoured. But to everyone's surprise, the burr also bypasses Seihi, causing genuine resentment in the mercenary boss. Suddenly, the burr stops and turns his head in the direction from which the noise comes to him. And so does the mercenary boss, who follows the movement of the burr, also looks in the same direction. With that said, Seihi is also gazing into the distance and beginning to realize what everyone is so interested in. After all, not far from standing in the bushes with her hands covering her head, a shrunken Sori sits. And now, the burr is heading straight to the girl sitting in the reeds. And Seihi realizes how this could end and urges Sori to save himself, who, reacting to the voice of her comrade, raises her head in surprise to see what danger is threatening her. In the meantime, the distance between burr and Sori begins to shorten noticeably, and now the beast is almost reaching its prey. However, Sori, still sitting on the ground, doesn't understand what it all means, or how she should proceed. In this case, the boss of the mercenaries watching the picture is already beginning to doubt whether Huemori is in front of him or not. And what's more important is that if Sori gets eaten by a crocodile, there's a chance that the boss will be blamed. Meanwhile, Seihi also heads to Sori, resenting the swamp and the fact that he was distracted by the mercenaries and wasted time. At the same time, burr doesn't even think about slowing down and continues to advance on Sori, who is just about to notice the huge crocodile's mouth open to attack right in front of her. And Seihi, seeing that, these will be followed by the inevitable, realizes that it's all too late. But as it turns out, not all is lost for Sori, who senses danger and starts to lose her temper. And starting to release claws, followed by a plume of ice, he strikes the crocodile with all his might, while shouting curses. And already the crocodile is off the ground, with a mortal wound flying over the standing Sori. The crocodile, feeling that this battle will be lost for him, falls with his back on the ground. And Sori, continuing to express himself without realizing what he was doing, prepares to strike another blow at Sori. And that blow comes on the very body from Sori, flying accompanied by ice at him. At that, the crocodile is once again understood in the air by a single kick of Sori's leg. And so ends the age of the crocodile burr, who falls to the surface defeated. Meanwhile, Seihi walks over to Sasen and leans over his scarred body. Sori, still in a furious state, stares silently at the crocodile's wounded torso. And Seihi, realizing that he's ending it all, wants to know how Sori will look at it. Before proceeding further, however, Seihi decides to take care of business first. And already Seiha's battle weapon is slamming into the beast's body, and the memories of the caster are beginning to overwhelm Seiha, who sees a man standing behind bars and who has come a long way that will bode well for his reward. And maybe we should give the foreign Sanshin a couple of two simple hints, where one of them becomes stabbing a knife through space, which should make it clearer what is wanted from him. Namely that not much will be required of Sanshin, and the river will become his haven, where he must destroy everything but humans. And from that, Seihi begins to come to his senses, not realizing what kind of memories from just being able to see. So someone released Sanshin into the river on purpose. But even if they did, what's their purpose? And in general, it may be that this is due to the boss and his group of mercenaries who are beginning to actively regroup. The mercenary boss still hasn't come to his senses and doesn't realize what he's just seen with his own eyes. However, it's time to get a grip and stop relaxing, for which the mercenary boss orders the summoning of all the guys. And one of the mercenaries should call for the messenger, and the others should take up their bows and be ready. And Seihi, watching the whole thing, just thinks the mercenary boss is making too much noise. But even though Seiha has a strong interest in finding out what kind of people they are, you have to be careful and stay out of the way. Besides, Seihi is worried about the condition of Sori, who is once again sitting with her hands covering her head. And when Seiha asks what she's doing, Sori looks around excitedly, wondering if the mercenaries are gone or not, to which Seihi immediately gives the truthful answer that the mercenaries are still here. And how can it be that Sori is afraid of some ragamuffins when he can handle a monster with one left? But that's not the point at all. But the commotion coming from the mercenaries begins to distract Seihi from having a frank conversation with Sori, and seeing the mercenaries rushing towards the lying bows, Seihi decides to attack them, while the tiger's power remains in the battle weapon. However, considering that this is not an option, Seihi turns to Sori and asks if she still wants to ride the turtle. Meanwhile, the mercenary boss on the various sides continues to hand out instructions to keep their bows at the ready. At that, Seihi, getting an affirmative answer from Sori to his question about the turtle, is already putting his hand up for the girl's leg, which bounces high up in the direction of the river with all its might, where he plunges straight into the water, as Seihi, who is still on the shore, can certainly attest. At this, Seihi himself, neglecting the difficult movement through the sinking mud, begins to follow Sori to the water, and approaching the water's edge, Seihi pushes off from the shore and jumps into the waters of the Dona River. Meanwhile, the mercenary boss, not realizing where Seihi and Sori have gone, orders his men to shoot them as soon as they appear. However, no matter how long one waits for the fugitives to appear, Seihi and Sori's mercenary boss doesn't show on the surface of the water. And being confused as to why they don't surface, the mercenary boss suggests that they may have drowned. But this continues until the mercenary boss notices Seihi and Sori on the opposite side of the river from them. The mercenary boss is confused as to how it is possible that they were able to cross so quickly. And Seihi, still seeing his pursuers, realizes that they have time to break away, since there are no boats to cross. In addition, Seihi expresses his gratitude to Konchar for being able to drop them off, but only Koncharu is in turn grateful to Seihi for not only not consuming him, but also ridding these waters of Sasen. However, this answer doesn't seem to please Seihi, who clutches his battle weapon even tighter in his hand. But no matter what, it's time for Seihi and Sori to continue on their way, and Koncharu should be on his way back too. However, Koncharu is not willing to say goodbye to the Black Tiger so easily, as he asks him to wait a few minutes. Which is clearly not in Seiha's plans, who also has to calm down Sori, who wants to ride the turtle again. And after getting rejected, Sori is furious because he thinks that this time, Seihi wants to ride Koncharu alone, who, at this very moment, swims closer to Seihi and holds out some item to him. And that gift is Seihi's bundle that was lost by Sori during the last turtle ride attempt. This makes Seiha genuinely grateful to Konchar for never telling him about his encounter with the Black Tiger, to which Koncharu nods affirmatively, and immediately gets the next question of why the Black Tiger didn't devour the turtle. But all the Black Tiger could say at that moment was that there was no use for Koncharu. And that's what was said to Konchar, but doesn't Seiha have it in her mind? Seihi, however, throws out that he's not sure what Koncharu told him, and draws Sori behind him. And Koncharu, happily seeing off his guests, says that he will always be happy to see them off, especially the Black Tiger, who says with certainty that he will not return to these waters. But if he does, Konchar better stay out of the water. And so, Seihi and Sori leave the waters of the Dona River, leaving Koncharu there, to drift on the waves enjoying life. And somewhere else at another time in another place, a child with tears in his eyes is trying to run away from the chase. And what he clutches so carefully in his hands is a human foot wrapped neatly in cloth. At the same time, the child with such a burden runs away from the uninterrupted chase with all his might. And each time the child gets more and more scared, but he doesn't give up trying to keep going. Even though there is a heartbreaking scream from his pursuer behind him, the boy clutches his leg tightly. And at that moment, the child is followed by the one whose leg the boy stole. And the dead man's goal is to take the leg that's rightfully his. That said, it seems like Stalker is unwilling to give up the chase attempt until he gets the limb back. And already the child is in range of the dead man, who catches up with the boy each time. Who, even though he senses the approaching danger, continues to run away with his burden unceasingly. Suddenly, something happens that is not expected by a child who screams in surprise, all because a boy not paying attention to the road slips and starts sliding down the slope. The child is already rolling down the mountain trying to protect his head and not paying attention to the leg that flies in the other direction. And the boy himself, having lost his footing, flies down with his eyes closed and arms spread out in fear. And as soon as the kid lands, he starts rubbing where the impact is most severe. Suddenly, a realization comes to the child, and he stares in amazement at his hands where a human foot had just been. And since there is no human leg in his hands, the boy starts looking around for the missing one, until eventually he discovers a foot lying not far from him. And picking himself up under the continued wailing of the dead man, the boy gets to his treasure. At the same time, holding the leg against himself, and under the endless sobbing of the child on his feet, continues to run. And this continues until the boy, having found shelter behind a rock, decides to take a break. And the dead man keeps following him around, and the boy feels it. And all that remains is to ask God for help to save not only him, but also his mother, in exchange for the fact that he will live honestly. And tears continue to flow from the closed eyes of a child who does not want to think about what will happen, until his attention begins to shift, forcing the child to open his eyes and scout the situation. And as soon as the boy opens his eyes, he stumbles upon Sori's face, looking at him in surprise. And since this encounter occurs suddenly, the boy loses his temper and jumps up in fear. But realizing that the extra sound would attract the dead man, the child clamps his mouth shut to keep from screaming. And then the boy decides that he should introduce himself, calling himself Daehan and wondering what Sori is doing in these parts. A picture of a mercenary boss with a naked weapon stalking her, and Seihi immediately comes to mind. But all Sori can say in response, without going into detail, is that she's being followed. And the boy doesn't know what he means, but he decides that she's being chased by these dead people. And seeing that Sori, in order to find out who is hiding under the word, These peeks out from under the rock trying to hold her back, where Sori's escort Seihi successfully kills the dead man, who was chasing Daehan who stole his leg. But Daehan, of course, not seeing this picture trying to pull Sori down, asks her to keep her head down and hide with him. Daehan wonders where Sori's house is, and seeing the direction the girl is pointing, Daehan decides that it's near his house in Tudenri. But if that's the case, what's Sori doing in the woods at this hour all alone? And Daehan finds out that Sori got lost when Seihi left an order not to go anywhere and went to get food for them. At the same time, Daehan, seeing that even in such a situation Sori doesn't cry, concludes that she is very brave, and Daehan decides that he too should pull himself together, because unlike Sori, he's not lost. Which means Daehan has to help Sori by suggesting she follow him to take her home. But Sori, who seeing Seihi dispose of the dead man, disregards Daekin's request to get down and don't dare turn around. Seihi watched as Sori's head peeked out from under a rock, not even realizing what she was doing. Meanwhile, Sori sees Seihi paying attention to her and starts waving at him, which is not at all clear to Seihi, who doesn't understand what Sori is trying to say. Which, leaving Daekin's hiding place, decides to head after the boy, continuing to clutch the stolen leg. And Daehan, not hearing any more pursuit, decides that they managed to break away, asks Sori to go up, thinking that this way they will get there faster. But then Sori's attention turns to the human leg, which Daehan explains is the cure. After all, Dakin's mom is very sick, and yesterday in a dream, the boy appeared to a mountain spirit who was able to show him where to get the medicine. Dakin not only had to dig up the dead man, but also take off his leg and then boil it and feed it to his mother, which would make the disease go away. And apparently this story makes a huge impression on Sori, because she loses even the power of speech. And when the speech comes back to her, the first thing Sori asks is whether or not Daehan eats people, to which she gets a negative answer. But does it really matter? Because Dakin's mom will never know about it, and the boy is ready to be punished by Yamaraji. After Daehan's father went to heaven, his mom invested a lot of effort to raise a boy who was willing to go to any lengths for her. But Sori unfortunately can't understand Daehan's feelings, since she doesn't have a mom, for which the boy apologizes to her. However, behind all this talk, Dakin, seeing the forest ahead, realizes that something is amiss here. Namely that there should be a wooden bridge at this spot, which means that Daehan is turned the wrong way. Dashin also sees glowing eyes behind the trees that scare him a lot, but there's a chance he's just imagining it. But no matter what, Daehan shouldn't tell Sori about it because it might scare her, but he shouldn't deceive her either. And as soon as Dane decides to tell Sori about it, he notices that the girl is not with him. And if that's the case, then where's Sori going? Has the ghost been haunting the kids all this time? And besides, are there really jackals behind the trees? Because Mom told Dehane that jackals attack people in the mountains. And since that's the case, Daehan has to do something. And before he runs away, he has to help Sori, who is probably in trouble. Daehan's gaze suddenly stumbles upon an unsuspecting Sori, walking peacefully out from behind the bushes, and it kicks the crap out of a scared Daehan seeing the whole thing. While still continuing to clutch his leg, the boy wants to know why Sori is coming out of there in the first place, to which he gets a completely casual answer, that Sori was only leaving to go to the bathroom, which just doesn't sit right with the still anxious boy trying to repeat Sori's words. But anyway, Dakin decides to go back, because besides the fact that they are lost in these places, it is dangerous because of jackals. However, this doesn't scare Sori, who is happy to report that she loves doggies. Daehan and Sori continue their journey to the house, during which the boy learns that Sori has not only no parents, but also no home. Suddenly, Daehan, not wanting to contain his joy, announces that they are finally finding their way. And the evidence of that is the log bridge, which you only have to pass over, and there it is not far to the dam. But you have to be very careful as the rain has increased the current below, and even an adult can be endangered. Daehan is not the first time he has walked across this bridge, so he decides to go first. But when he looks around, he doesn't find Sori, which at this point, having overtaken Dakin, is already flying down the log, disregarding the raging torrents of water. However, such absurdity is very frightening to Dakin, who tries to warn Sori without noticing as he releases the extracted human leg. But when the realization reaches Dakin, it's too late as her foot flies straight into the water. And as soon as a human foot touches the surface, it immediately disappears into the abyss of water with a splash. Without even leaving a trace of its presence so quickly, the water swallows up Dakin's prey, who realizes that this time he's losing a human leg, hard won and risking his life forever. And without even paying any attention to the waters of the river, Dakin follows Sori with a drooping head and tears in his eyes, who can't believe that Daehan threw away a human leg that he treasured so much. And Sori's partly right. After all, the mountain spirit who came to Dakin in a dream suggested how he could save his mom, and now almost reaching home, the boy loses the chance. But it seems that such an admission and the realization that this is the only chance for salvation is very surprising to Sori, who reiterates that it's a human foot, which pisses off an already frustrated Daehan. I mean, Sori's right, and Daehan must be crazy to believe such nonsense, and it greatly offends the sensibilities of a mountain spirit who is out of his mind that Daehan dares to call him a thing, since most likely the spirit or Sanshin is just an illusion that is formed from Daikin's desires, who bitterly realizing this can't hold back the tears that come to his eyes. But anyway, Daehan pulls himself together because he believes he's responsible for Sori, whom he promised to see off. And as a sign of her help, Dakin extends her hand to Sori, who in turn accepts Dakin's help by putting her own into it. And so, Daehan, leading Sori, talks about Daddy's passing due to pneumonia and lack of food, because the spirits of the earth are angry. Daehan's only wish is not only to cure her mom, but to be able to eat her fill for one. But realizing that Daehan talks too much about himself and his desires, he wants to know what Sori is dreaming of, who only holds out a package to him. However, Daehan does not have time to unwrap the package and find out what is hidden there, because at that moment, a woman's voice calls his name, and that person is Daehan's mom, who opens her arms in a hug heading towards her son, who doesn't hide his joy as he rushes to meet his mom. After all, Daehan's mom was very scared when she woke up and saw that her son wasn't around, for which Daehan apologizes to her. But suddenly the boy freezes in incomprehension as he has only one question in his mind for his mom, and it consists of how Daehan's sick mom was able to get up from the settlement, at which mom reports that strange things happened to her. And it all starts with waking up and seeing that Daehan is not at home. His mom overpowered herself to try to leave the house. And just as she reaches the gate, Daehan's mom notices a man standing in the dark asking if she's the boy's mom. The first thing that came to the woman's mind at that moment was that the Reaper had come for her soul and it was time to say goodbye to life. But instead, the man who thought he was following Dakin finds himself arriving at the place earlier and asks for a chance to wait it out. And Dahan's mom finds nothing to give her consent, but the man wants to know what's bothering her, in addition to thanking her. That said, this question seems to cause a bit of a stupor for Dahan's mom, as she doesn't expect to hear something like that at all. However, Seihi continues to say that the cough sounds abnormal and asks her to let her listen in. But such a request causes conflicted feelings for Dahan's mom, since she is a widow and has no right to extend her wrist to a stranger, who, realizing the seriousness of the consequences, insisted on listening to Dahan's mom. And as soon as Seihi gets his consent, he immediately pulls out the medicine contained in the tube from his bundle, while informing Dahan's mom that the instant cure would not cure her, but would allow her to breathe much easier. But it seems that Dahan's mother does not believe in such a miracle, and by habit rises to her feet expecting her former condition. However, once she realizes that she's actually feeling better, she starts cheering, and Seihi talks about how she needs to eat better to heal. And for this, Seihi leaves a handful of coins on the doorstep, but since the man must not stay in the widow's house, he must leave it. And with that, Sahi leaves Dakin's house without waiting for his traveler, with his mom trying to stop Sahi to say thank you. However, Seihi asks Dahan's mom not to go out, since with her condition the cold wind is contraindicated. And hearing that Dahan will come home safe and sound, his mom calms down, and now notes that Seihi is actually handsome. And so, on that note, Seihi from Dahan's mom's story disappears, and the boy still can't believe his mom is okay and he's not dreaming. But still, mom wants to know where Dashin went at night, who, instead of answering, remembers that he forgot to introduce his friend. This time, however, like last time, Dahan turned around and didn't find Sori nearby, thinking she was hiding in the bushes, and darting after Sori Daheng doesn't notice the bundle given to him fall to the ground next to his mom, who once she opens it and sees the spine, can't believe her eyes. And that's because this package contains not just any bell, but real wild ginseng. But where did such a flower come from in their land? For it could be sold for as much as 200 nannies. And then Dahan leaves his mom behind and takes off without giving any explanation as to where he's going again, since all Dahan can say now is that he'll be back soon and running in Sori's footsteps. And as soon as he notices her, Dahan reaches out to her and tries to call out to his friend. At that, Sori hears Dakin's voice and looks back at his call but doesn't say a word. Dahan tries to stop her, wondering where she's going, and asks her to stay with him for a while. But as much as Sori doesn't want to, she still has to go back to her house too. And on that note, Sori leaps from his seat and, pushing off the ground with all his might, jumps high up. With that, the remaining still standing, Dakin does not manage to finish his speech, interrupting in surprise. And all Dahan can still say is to wish Sori a good road and promise to live a righteous life. And so, on that note, Dakin returns alone to his still waiting mom, still on the road. Meanwhile, Sori lands right where Seihi is sitting, who reminds Sori that they're being chased by mercenaries and asks them to keep their noses out of other people's business next time. But that's not all, as Seihi wants to know if Sori knows where the ginseng has disappeared, to which he gets a negative answer, keeping the way to the village. However, the time is approaching nightfall and Seihi builds a fire in preparation for a night's lodging. But the voice in Seiha's head keeps him on his toes, as the Black Tiger's voice reiterates that Seiha's mind is in a mess. In fact, according to Black Tiger, Seihi probably doesn't realize the situation that's going on around him. After all, Seihi could just as easily have absorbed Sori at the very moment she was destroying Burr. And Seihi realizes that everything Black Tiger says is the absolute truth, and in this case, there's no point in arguing. Since in all the time spent with Sori, Seihi might have taken the right opportunity to devour the girl more than once. But he doesn't, since Black Tiger feels like everything else is just Seiha's excuses. Even now, with Sori sleeping by the fire, Seihi can use her defenselessness to her advantage. So, is Seihi going to say again that it's not the right time for a takeover? In doing so, Black Tiger asks Seihi to remember the past 3 years, and it is now that he gets the chance so easily and easily. Also, the Black Tiger should remind Seihi how many days he's been in hiding in an attempt to catch luck by the tail. For always in Seiha's way, there were only small bipeds that went only one tooth in his path. And in Seiha's mind, pictures of him chasing the Sanshins begin to pop up, where on the first one, he takes his battle weapon out of its sheath. But in another picture, Seihi is already unleashing his battle weapon and trying to catch up with his opponent. Finally, Seihi focuses his gaze intently on his enemy, without missing an opportunity to use his weapon. However, Seihi should also be reminded of how many times he failed during his hunt. But the way Seihi will do now with Sori will wait for her to grow up and devour her, or everything will happen after finding a name for her. It may not even be 1 year, but 100 years, and Seihi will be waiting all this time. And realizing Seiha's condition, Black Tiger thinks it's just his stupid, inexplicable excuses. And besides, if Seihei doesn't destroy the doubt in his heart, then revenge will never come, so he has no right to hold a gun. As suddenly amongst all the thoughts in Seihi's head, his hearing begins to pick up some extraneous movement. And Seihi, deciding he hadn't heard that, jumped up and grabbed his battle weapon. With that, Seihi is already preparing to rush forward towards Sanshin, leaving a sleeping Sori by the fire. For it is at this very moment that he notices someone's presence and does not hesitate to rush towards the third extra. But Seihi's sword slices through the air, and Seihi thinks it's just a shadow. But then, where is its master? And Seiha's eyes catch sight of something leaping out of its seat and darting away at lightning speed. At that, Seihi doesn't abandon his attempt to catch Sanshin's eye, and is already flying after the creature. But what Seiha's gaze notices makes him genuinely surprised at what he sees. Since as the supposed enemy, Seihi sees the most common black cat sitting on a rock in front of him. However, Seihi begins to slowly come around, as this is not what Black Tiger seems to want to see. But be that as it may, Seihi's task is to catch up with Sanshin, and he is not willing to deviate from his goal under any circumstances. However, to Seihi's surprise, the black cat notices Seihi's attacking pose and immediately snaps out of his seat and disappears off the rock. At the same time, Seihi also picks up speed and begins to chase after Sanshin, still holding his battle weapon at the ready, which also relentlessly continues to follow Sanshin on his heels, without slowing down his speed for a moment. Once again, to Seihi's surprise, the black cat sits on a rock as if nothing had happened, watching the black tiger invitingly, who, apparently tired of chasing the cat, thinks he's not as fast as he is. And the black cat, as if teasingly having already turned its face to the black tiger, continues to look at him. Suddenly he takes off and, having gained the necessary speed, heads towards the forest. Seihi concludes that the black cat is just an illusion, and that succumbing to the spell of a ghost sounds strange. However, Seihi is 100% sure that he was able to recognize Sanshin's energy, which means it can't be a trick. And since this is the case, Seihi hesitates in his actions and decides to leave Sori with his things and go on a scouting mission. But it wasn't to be, because just at that very moment, Seihi notices Sori standing next to him, yawning at the top of her lung, who won't open her eyes and won't go back to the campfire without Seihi, and Seihi can't figure out when she's had time to come over. But instead of asking a question, Sori, still in a dream, hands Seihi his headdress and the bundle of belongings he left behind. At the same time, the black cat stops its movement and looks at the travelers as if inviting them to follow it, and the same black cat once again scurries away, leaving behind only the shadow of its presence. At this, Seihi realizes that the black cat stops as soon as they lose sight of him, but starts running away again when they approach. And Sori, still in a drowsy state, continues to follow the pursuing cat Seihi, who thinks this cat behavior is clear as day since it looks like the cat is luring them in. Suddenly, Seihi stops abruptly because something ahead catches his attention, and this turn of events is not expected by Sori, who is still asleep and crashes forcefully into Seihi's bundle, who is very surprised by what he sees. And this surprise is transmitted to Sori, who is fast asleep, who just can't contain her emotions and under the influence of surprise cries out. And the reason for this is that Seihi and Sori are facing a thick fog in the middle of the night, and only thanks to the black tiger's vision can Seihi see anything. And besides, Seihi is pretty sure that inside this fog is Sanshin's energy, but one question is still unclear: why all this catching up? But to give an answer to his question, Seihi needs to spring into action, and he pulls his headdress harder over his eyes. And the next thing he does is call out to Sori, who thinks they're going for food, but Seihi wants to know who's luring him and where. And so, Seihi and Sori follow the lining of thick fog to solve the mystery of the cat taunting them. But what Seihi and Sori see ahead makes them slow their step and eventually stop. At this, Seihi begins to look around to see something that alarms him, and his example is followed by Sori, who is also looking for the reason for their stop it. But ahead, there is only fog that shrouds the outline not only of the fence, but also of the house behind it. Suddenly, Sori's attention is drawn to something that causes her to take her mind off her previous thoughts and switch gears. For in front of her, just on the fence opposite her, are pasted the very talismans that restrain the box in which she was being moved. And in order to be sure of this, Sori begins to look at her, which finally convinces her that she is right. But as soon as Sori realizes this, terror grips her so much that she dares not utter a word. And to protect herself from the mascots, Sori hides behind a clueless Seiha. And deciding to find out what's wrong, Seihi notices that the girl is so scared that she can't open her eyes. And it's all due to the exorcism talismans that Seiha thinks can't hurt Sori at all. And besides, how could such talismans hurt Sori, who was able to destroy a huge spirit with her bare hands? And hearing that Sori isn't afraid of the talismans at all, Seihi asks him to take his hands off it because he can't move. But then his words are interrupted as Seihi notices someone with fear in their eyes, peeking at them through a crack in the window. However, as soon as the commoner notices that he has been spotted, he immediately closes the window, hiding inside the house. Seihi continues to look around and concludes that neither he nor Sori are welcome in these parts. Suddenly, Sori's attention is drawn to the children running in an unknown direction, creating the appearance of play. At that, the last child who runs by also seems to notice Sori looking at them with an unbroken gaze. As at this very moment, the child's head begins to turn, and the glowing eyes notice Sori, and the mouth of the strange child with the glowing eyes begins to blur into a satisfied smile. But that doesn't seem to please Sori, who looks more surprised than pleased by what she sees. And then a wooden child with glowing eyes turns to Sori and calls out to her to join them. And the reason is that the wooden children want to invite Sori to play with them, but you have to approach them to do it. Seihi sees this action and thinks that this time of day is not the best time to play. And besides, children are not simple. But his words fly past the ears of Sori, who is already looking at the received offer to join the game with loving eyes. And if Sori wants to join the kids, she needs to hurry up, or they'll start without her. And since that's the case, Sori still doesn't listen to Seihi and doesn't pay any attention to him already flying towards the wooden children. At this, Seihi only just manages to reach out to Sori in an attempt to hold her back. But Seihi's hand, instead of the one Sori just standing next to him, is only grabbing air. And since that's the case, Seihi, thinking he's a liability, decides to take the chance to find out what's going on. And besides, Seiha doesn't think anyone in these parts is capable of doing any harm to Sori, who is already running after the wooden children who keep calling her to their game. And Sori is so excited about the offer that she doesn't even look where her name is called. But as soon as Sori stops, her attention is focused on something standing just across from her in the distance. And what Sori begins to see in front of her takes her by such surprise that she can't hold back the exclamation, since just opposite her is neither one nor three children, but a whole group of wooden children standing next to a big tree in the fog. And if Sori wants to join them, it's about time they started their game. And the rules are that whoever gets caught next starts driving, which doesn't seem clear to Sori, but the game has already begun, and the one who drives starts counting with his back, turned to the scattered wooden children. And now the count is up to 6, and everyone is scattering, and Sori, who is looking at them, doesn't understand how she should act. At the same time, the girl running past Sori once again tells her that she should run away, or she will be the one caught. And the scary face of the fleeing wood begins to blur into a smile, and the count, meanwhile, comes to 8. However, Sori doesn't understand what they want from her, as she stands there as before without daring to move from her seat. And so, at 10, the water finishes counting, and talks about going looking, in the hope that everyone has hidden. But as soon as the wooden child turns his head, he notices that Sori hasn't run away, still continuing to stand still. And since that's the case, it's Sori who's first in line to drive next, since the wooden baby is already headed her way. And it is Sori who will be the next child in line to be caught by the looming wooden boy reaching out to her. However, Sori doesn't like such rules of the game, as well as the game itself at all, and doesn't want to play such a game. But such demands of Sori are not at all in line with the one who is driving, and at this very moment approaching the girl. And as soon as the wooden child catches up to Sori, he bites her with all his might on her forward exposed arm, which is even more disliked by Sori, yes, and to whom it causes her unbearable pain. And all Sori can do to respond to the villain's antics is throw a punch that throws the wooden boy back. And Sori looks at his injured arm and notices that there is a strong bite in the very spot where the wooden boy had clung. At the same time, the wooden boy who flew away informs that Sori was caught, and since that is the case, the one who will be caught will be eaten. And echoing his words, others attracted to the game begin to pull up to Sori, saying that whoever is caught will be eaten. And as if by magic from nowhere, wooden children begin to surround Sori, repeating the words of their water. And Sori continues to stand there, not daring to take a step, holding on to his wounded arm. At the same time, the voices of the wooden children appearing in the fog come closer and closer, repeating the mere words, "Eat," which doesn't please Sori, who is caught off guard and looking in the direction the kids are coming from, with the wooden girl on the row, with everyone getting closer to Sori each time she talks about letting herself be eaten. That more than before begins to piss off Sori, from which ice shards begin to fly in different directions, and the wooden children come closer and closer to Sori, starting to surround her from all sides, keeping repeating the same thing. And now each of the wooden children open their huge mouths to bite and then eat Sori, who finds herself in too close proximity to the crazy wooden children stepping on her. Suddenly, Sori's rage spills out, allowing her to break free from the vicious circle of maddened wooden people. But Sori jumps out not alone, but with her head clutched in the healthy hand of one of the wooden children. And the next thing Sori does is press the wooden decapitated body into the ground, making a big dent around it. Turning to the wooden children still standing in the circle, Sori reiterates that there is no reason to play such games. But it has no effect on the wooden children who continue to stare at Sori, who immediately jump out of their seats and open their huge mouths to attack the wounded girl, who has pulled herself together and is preparing to fend off a new onslaught of pesky wooden children. Suddenly, Sori's consciousness begins to fog up, and the girl losing her balance is already leaning to the side, and the wooden children get closer and closer to Sori each time, wanting to take advantage of her position. But the wish of the wooden children is not destined to come true, as at this very moment they are overtaken by Seiha's battle weapon, who manages to arrive in time to help Sori, who is losing her ability to navigate in space. And Seihi smashes the wooden children with a single blow, blocking their path to the unconscious Sori. And those wooden kids who weren't hit by Seihi are starting to switch to him, leaving Sori alone. And now the desired object of the wooden children is Seihi, who notices the stares directed at him, which makes him concentrate on helping Sori, who's trapped. And already Seiha's battle weapon was catching up to the wooden child gaping at him. But instead of one child, the rest of the black tiger begins to come at Seihi in the same way. And now, one by one, the battle weapon touches Seihi, who thinks that this way he is finished with his enemies. Suddenly, Seiha's slanted gaze notices someone standing quite a distance from the black tiger. And that enemy is a wooden girl who apparently senses the emanating danger from the black tiger. Because at that very moment, the wooden girl turns around and starts running in the opposite direction of Seiha. But her fate is sealed, as she is already in the sights of not only the black tiger, but also his battle weapon. And Seiha's battle weapon catches up with the wooden child, who has already managed to run away from him for a considerable distance. And Seihi, seeing the result of his actions, picks himself up to continue rejecting the enemies that overtake him. As at this very moment, a new wave of wooden men are heading towards Seihi with renewed vigor. Meanwhile, the wounded Sori is still unable to move from her position without orienting herself. And just then, Seihi comes to her rescue, where Sori tries to see a familiar face. Meanwhile, Seihi is leaning over Sori, asking her to show him her injured arm, which continues to bear the huge bite mark of the wooden boy who started the strange game. And it occurs to Seihi that what could have caused Sori's condition is nothing but poison. And if it does, you must do everything you can to neutralize it, or it could be irreparable. In the meantime, the wooden baby is starting to catch up with his head reaching out, and already the hand from the headless body is touching its part awaiting reunion, which follows just as soon as both hands begin to screw the head into its rightful place. And although it happens backwards, the head is already sitting on the neck of his body, and his eyes begin to search for his victim. At the same time, this phenomenon is not clear to Seiha, who looks around and begins to assess the situation, in which each of the wooden parts of wooden bodies begin to find each other to assemble into a whole. And Seihi, thinking that what's happening seems too suspicious, decides to retreat. And hearing Seihi's lamentations, Seihi tries to calm her down, and tells her that as soon as they return, they will immediately start treating her. While still conscious, Sori tells Seihi that she doesn't like wooden children at all, and Seihi agrees. Also, Sori talks about how she's really hot and wants to get naked, which doesn't please Seihi at all. And what Seihi dislikes even more is that they go back to the same tree. And that's even more displeasing to Seihi, who once again makes sure there's something wrong with this place. And when asked by Sori if they have already come, Seihi is forced to tell the truth and answer no. At that, the wooden children's joyous voices about Sori being back are starting to echo throughout the neighborhood. And Seihi, thus accepting the challenge, decides to determine who will emerge victorious in this battle. But his thoughts are disturbed by Sori's moan, telling him that something inexplicably strange is happening to her, since she can't see anything anymore. And Seihi is left with no choice but to abandon his desire, and once again seek help from an exhausted Sori. But it doesn't turn out to be that simple, and to check the situation, Seihi looks back, where they are followed on their heels by wooden children, with faces just as distraught with the desire to eat them. And the wooden children now, as in the beginning, do not stop repeating that he who is caught must be eaten. Seihi turns his head and notices that the wooden child, who is repeating the same old phrase, is very close and is about to attack. And Seihi has no choice but to once again call upon his battle weapon for help, which he successfully uses to fend off the wooden man's attack and knock him far back. And now the wooden child is flying, and Seihi is not lowering his battle weapon, preparing for another attack. Because at this very moment, the first wooden child is replaced by another who is ready to eat Sori, and the one that was decapitated by Seihi catches his head on the fly to return it to its rightful place on his body. And Seihi, seeing this resurgence, realizes that he can't handle them at this rate. And to make matters worse, Seihi once again notices the same tree in front of him, surrounded by thick fog. And it didn't seem to Seihi at all, because even going the other way, they return to the original place, which can't be a mistake. And Sori temporarily regains consciousness again, telling Seihi that everything around her is spinning, indicating severe intoxication. Seihi tries to calm Sori down, and tells her to be patient, because when they get out of this place, she can rest. And Seihi is correct in thinking that going after the fog was their big mistake, since Seihi couldn't even figure out who their opponent was. And it's all because Seihi relied too much on the Black Tiger's power. But since that's the case, Seihi must destroy the hearth of the wooden children. But it is worth bearing in mind that if the spell covers a whole village, then the hearth must be very large. And then there's this fog that's confusing, so where it thickens the most is the focus of the Karas. And besides, no matter what path Seihi and Sori take, they keep coming back to the giant tree. At the same time, Seihi, having put all his thoughts in order and looking at the tree, begins to realize that it is the epicenter of evil. Once again, Seihi, with Sori looping beside him, is moving towards the huge tree. At the same time, each time approaching him closer and closer, holding his Black Tiger battle weapon at the ready. Once again, Seiha's attention is drawn to the extraneous movement echoing from the side of the travelers. And when Seihi turns his head, he notices a wooden child crawling towards him in an attacking pose, who immediately gets hit with a battle weapon aimed at him by Seihi. Meanwhile, the other wooden children take advantage of Seihi's distraction from Sori and prepare to take her over. But Seihi manages to spot the impending ambush on the unsuspecting Sori just in time, and immediately to protect the child, reflects with his battle weapon the attack of the maddened wooden children. And this is how Seihi protects the unconscious Sori once again. But it doesn't end there so quickly, as the wooden children, who have managed to recover, come at him again. However, the movement of these wooden children slows down as a thick fog begins to envelop them, and Seihi has no choice but to breathe a sigh of relief at being able to get rid of the pesky wood. But Seiha's state of relief doesn't last long, as he is again forced to concentrate to catch the extraneous noise, all the while still continuing to move away from the damn tree with Seiha beside him, barely weaving behind him. And just like all the previous times, Seihi begins to realize that he is losing his bearings again. Oh, and besides, the sensation of the presence of an intruder makes him keep his battle weapon at the ready. But what was Seiha's surprise to see an animal-like creature instead of a wooden child, which, on closer inspection, begins to take on the shape of a very ordinary cat. And this cat, calmly perched on top of the fence, continues to watch Sori and Seihi. He looks at the animal and doesn't have time to finish his guess, as he is interrupted by Seihi, who has regained consciousness. But at the words of the cat calling, Seihi finally faints and begins to slump backwards. However, Seihi manages to catch the girl in time to prevent her from falling to the ground. And tasting Sori Seihi's forehead, Seihi notices that she is all burning, and this condition can be very dangerous even for Sanshin. In addition, this time, Seihi finally makes sure that Sori was poisoned with poison through the bite. But even knowing now the cause, Seihi will have a hard time finding a cure unless he knows what the poison was. And while Seihi was dealing with Sori, the cat watching them didn't even try to leave his seat. With that, the next thing the cat starts to do is make a loud noise in cat language, and then the cat changes its position and rises to its feet and begins to pull itself up with its front legs, which is followed by stretching the back of the legs, preparing the cat to resume movement. And now the cat stands up on all four paws and starts its movement on the top of the straw fence. But that's not all, as at that moment the cat turns her head and turns to Seihi as if to say, "Follow her." And her call is instantly picked up by Seihi, who, looking at the approaching wooden men, finds the offer very tempting. But be that as it may, Seihi can't help but think that this way they might fall into a new trap. However, looking at the distant cat and sensing the approach of the wooden children, Seihi realizes that they have no other choice. Meanwhile, the cat is already nearing the end of the straw fence, trying not to speed up her step in anticipation of Sori and Seiha. And so Seihi, with Sori in his arms and his sword ready for another attack, follows the cat. At the same time, one thought does not leave Seihi alone, since it was following the cat that they wandered into this village. And even knowing that this is most likely a new trap, Seihi still willingly jumps into it. But only one thing reassures Seihi, and that is that this cat is different than the one Seihi and Sori saw in the forest. And while Seihi continued to ponder, the Kanka meanwhile disappears from the sight of the Seihi following it, which obviously worries Seihi to some extent, who is already in a tight spot. But since it's too late to doubt, Seihi begins to speed up, changing his stride into a sprint. Meanwhile, the cat stops in the crevice of the fence from which the light comes, meowing invitingly. And once the cat makes sure she's in Seiha's line of sight, she goes inside. The next thing the cat does is walk towards a house with lights on in the windows. And Seihi, watching this picture, can't understand how such a low fence can protect the house from ghosts walking around. And besides, such peacefulness around rather arouses more suspicion. But Sori's condition leaves no other choice. And that's how Seihi, with Sori in her arms, walks through the low fence and into the courtyard. But before following into the house, Seihi decides to look around, and the first thing he sees are the neatly arranged jugs in one corner. And in the other direction, on neatly tied in stacks of firewood, cats sleep peacefully without paying attention to people. At the same time, behind the ajar shutters of the window, Seihi hears someone talking to the cat that they have visitors. And this obviously makes Seihi, who witnesses the conversation, even more suspicious. Suddenly, a woman's voice from the ajar window, addressing Seihi, invites them to go inside the house. But before they do, the same female voice asks Seihi, with Sori in her arms, to lock the wicket as tightly as possible. And Seihi, about to fulfill the request, turns to the ajar door of the wicket, behind which the ghosts still hover. But as soon as Seihi closes the wicket door, all the extraneous sounds behind it begin to fade, taking the woodies with them. And just outside the fence, as if there was no thick fog, the sun rises. The woman notices Seihi's surprise and realizes that he is confused, so she asks him to come inside to explain. But the fact that the woman addresses him as Mr. Black Tiger throws Seihi off balance, and the woman in turn introduces herself to him as Tan Yen, who is excited to meet the Black Tiger. And on that note, Black Tiger and his wounded companion go inside the house, as their journey was really not easy. At the same time, the woman handing the Black Tiger a drink wonders whether it was easy to find the path in the thick fog, to which Seihi immediately replies that without the cat's help, they would hardly be able to get out of it. And that apparently surprises Tan Yong, who's been wondering where her cat went and if she's brought out Seihi to do something worthy. But Tang Yeon doesn't have time to finish her thought, as Seihi interrupts her with the fact that they met a panther-like beast in the mountains. However, Tang Yeon is pretty sure that there are no such predators in the neighborhood, and that Seihi is probably mistaken. And not getting the expected answer to his question, Seihi switches to Sori, but Tan Yong can't say anything, since he's not a doctor. However, the bleeding from the injured arm has stopped, and judging from the fact that Sori has fallen asleep, we can conclude that the medicine is working. But still, Seiya has some doubts about the prescription medicine that can be made if one knows what kind of poison is used. And if the cure works, how is it possible that they could prepare it in such a short period of time, and even late at night? However, the feeling of lack of trust and some sort of wariness did not escape Tang Yen, for which Seihi apologizes, explaining that in the current situation, it is inexcusable for him to let his guard down. And such an answer is accepted by Tan Yen, who says that the medicine was prepared in advance for such cases. But that's not all, as Tang Yon was able to foresee something that surprises Seihi even more. However, if this is true, then Tang Yen must have already known about Seihi and Sori, and can predict fates in general. And besides, despite her blindness, Tang Yen's hands move quite naturally. But still, Seihi shouldn't touch or move things around, since if Seihi moves things even an inch, Tang Yan won't be able to find them, and now Seihi should drink the drink offered. But Seihi resists this, thinking that he is not bitten, but if he doesn't, the poison scattered in the fog will cause him to convulse. And this obviously reassures Seihi to some extent, who also wants to know what's going on in the village. After all, the fog, wooden ghost charms that prevent you from leaving the village and the talismans on the doors raise a lot of questions. But Tang Yeon is in no hurry to start her story, as she reminds Seihi that he doesn't even believe her. So, what's the matter with her explanation? And Seihi realizes what's going on and looks at the untouched medicine cup that Tang En is clearly hinting at. That being said, Seihi still wants to know if Tang En's eyes really can't see anything, since he was purposely making gulping sounds. But Tang En lets the question pass his ears and asks Seihi if he's seen a huge old tree in an empty field. And this guardian tree, in which the spirit that guards the village was still a month ago, pleasing everyone with lush foliage. But since the tree became lifeless, a fog descended on the land, and anyone touched by the poison was taken away, be it livestock or people. And so, Tang Yen tried to contain the poison with talismans while instructing the residents to stay indoors. But not everyone was ready for isolation, and anyone who even briefly went out for food, water, or medicine was caught by the dolls and dragged to a tree where people disappeared. That's why Seihi and Sori only saw the people who watched them with fear through the cracks in their houses. But does Tang Yen mean by disappearance that people took their lives in this way? And the same receives the answer that it is so, while among the remaining houses, few are still able to hold out. Seihi, realizing the seriousness of the situation, wants to know if there is something on the tree, and gets an answer about insects that look like monsters. However, even while talking, Tang Yan makes a remark that Seihi still doesn't trust her, because she won't let go of her battle weapon. Seihi finally makes sure that Tang Yan sees everything, but she doesn't, since she has a sense that allows her to read outsiders. And since it's true, Seihi wants to take this opportunity to learn about himself, but because the past is shrouded in a black veil, it's hard to do so. But that answer doesn't suit Seihi, who thinks that anyone can answer that way except for his only specialty, which is that Seihi's fate is cut short, but that doesn't mean he's about to say goodbye to life. And it is interpreted that Seihi should have been in heaven long ago, but the two fates cannot overlap, which is confirmed by Tan Yen saying that Seiha's share was always to become one with his battle weapon, which in some ways seems like an unpleasant and inexplicable discovery for Seiha. And since that's the case, Seihi asks Tang Yon for more reading, but the woman refuses, saying that's the end of it. At the same time, Seihi, who had been listening attentively to Tang Yen all this time, drinks the medicine in one gulp, and with a sound, returning the empty bowl to its place, tells Tang Yen that she'll be back soon. When asked about leaving, Seihi believes that he will pay not only for the fortune-telling, but also for the cure. But that doesn't mean Seihi trusts Tan Yen completely, because if the woman is a monster, and Seihi drinks poison tea, he doesn't have time to say anything. Since Tang En thinks it's impossible with Seihi continuing to talk about letting Tang En eat Sori as a reward, Tang Yen can't believe it, since despite Seihi's cruelty, he's no joke and gives him a jade bead, which will help Seihi choose a path to leave the village as the poisonous fog is able to deprive the landmark. Seihi himself looks at the bead and realizes that he doesn't know what he can and can't trust, but he can see the effect. And now standing in front of a huge lifeless tree, Seihi wants to know what kind of insect is playing with people's lives. But as it is, an ordinary tree was able to change so much in such a short period of time. And if the tree continued to grow, it could stand for hundreds more years and fulfill its function of protecting the village. But now, Seihi looks at the lifeless tree and regrets that it was the first victim of the village. Meanwhile, the wooden child watching Seihi bear his battle weapon wants to know what he's going to do. After all, wouldn't it be better for Seiha to drop everything and join in to play with the wooden kids? And for this, the most suitable game is the game of hide and seek, where Seihi is given the right to hide first. However, there is one condition. If Seihi is found by the wooden men, he will definitely be eaten by them. But Seihi decides to take the initiative because if the wood spirits like to hide, they'd better hide first, since they should now remember that if they are caught, they will be the ones to be eaten by Seihi. And at such a point, Seihi bared his battle weapon and prepared for further action, standing with his back to the wood spirits. Suddenly, Seihi abruptly jumps out of his seat and flies at the wooden men at a breakneck speed, thrusting his battle weapon forward, which he immediately, without moving from his seat, blows to pieces in one fell swoop. But it doesn't end there, as a new wave of wooden monsters attack Seihi from behind. However, instead of encasing Seihi in their deadly embrace, the wooden monsters miss grabbing air, as Seihi manages to dodge just in time while keeping his battle weapon in his hands, while successfully fending off an attack by the wooden men while remaining unharmed. But seeing that, once again, the wood spirits are at his approach, Seihi realizes that this battle is just a waste of his strength, since from the very beginning, Seiha's goal was, and still is, only the monster that sits inside the lifeless tree. And if it had been an ordinary tree, Seiha wouldn't have had the strength to cut it down. But now it was different since it was possessed by a ghost. That's a different matter, and Seihi using his battle weapon strikes the tree time after time, which each time reaches the realization of Seiha's original plan of already reaching the middle of the barrel, until eventually the lifeless tree trunk begins to lurch sideways. And now, in place of the mighty tree in front of Seihi, the only thing that remains of the former might is a stump. However, it doesn't end there, as Sanshin's power remains the same, and Seihi doesn't absorb memories. And if it was over, Seihi wouldn't see any wandering wooden men on the horizon. Suddenly, a surprised voice sounded behind Seiha's back, interrupting his musing, who up to this point had been full of mystery as to who had come to him, until he saw that it was Mr. Black Tiger. However, Seihi is unwilling to play riddles, and is ordered to show himself to whoever is having the conversation with. But the speaking voice is not so simple, as it realizes that no Sanshin in Dongha will show himself in front of Mr. Black Tiger, who is now destined to stay forever in the fog, where the monster puppets won't let him get bored. In the meantime, the wooden dolls have already climbed on top of each other to form a pyramid overhanging Seihi, and Seihi looks back and sees who he has to confront now. And still the same mocking voice of Sanshin from under the stump wants to know what Seihi thinks about this. And does Mr. Black Tiger even need such a toy belonging to the talking Sanshin? Seihi replies that, for the most part, he's not picky, but he doesn't have time to say anything, as he's interrupted by Sanshin from under the stump. But Seihi thinks it's unnecessary to waste time on idle chatter, as the pyramid of wooden dolls continues to grow. And one of them, gritting her teeth, tells the Black Tiger that there are many of them, and if he takes the life of one, two will live. After all, the rules of the game are that as long as one wooden toy lives, the other will live at its expense. And since that's the case, Mr. Black Tiger will never be able to handle all the wood spirits. That said, Seihi notes that the dolls move with charms and speak in the voice of the lurking Sanshin, and the insect's abilities would not be enough for such a creation. So who gave Sanshin such power? But hearing that the leader of everything is Tachan, Seihi is surprised and asks to repeat what was said. However, one of the wooden dolls realizes in time that she has said too much, and to make good on her reservation, she immediately starts attacking Seihi standing in front of her, who reacts in time and manages to bounce from the very place where the blow is planned. But the wooden puppet quickly gets its bearings and rises again to attempt the throw. And Seihi bounces away, dodging a direct attack from the wooden monsters as before. But the only thing Seihi doesn't have time to do is remove his hand, which is hit by a blow that leaves a bloody scratch mark. The wooden monsters are already presenting themselves to Seihi in the form of an insect, asking him to see the power granted by Tachan. And it was unlikely that such a pathetic fake of the Black Tiger could withstand the power of Tachan, which means the current Mr. Black Tiger has no chance of getting out of this place alive. But apparently Seihi holds a very different opinion, as at this very moment his battle weapon is ready to repel the blow, which just as times it hits the topmost wooden doll, with a crackle flying off to the side. However, it doesn't end there, as the next wooden monster prepares to attack. And now the wooden spirit is already dangerously grinning its maw and heading towards its opponent, Mr. Black Tiger. That being said, Seihi is now as successful in deflecting the onslaught of the multi-legged wooden monster as in previous times. But having managed to duck from the wood spirit's hand, inflicted blow, Seihi doesn't notice the other, because at this very moment, after a series of blows, he is thrown aside with tremendous force. But having managed to stay on his feet, Seihi assesses the situation and realizes that the monster's speed has increased significantly. However, seeing the moment the bodies reunite to build the pyramid, the principle of how it works begins to dawn on Seiha, and the newly formed pyramid of wooden bodies ready for another onslaught doesn't understand why Seihi is looking away. And before he could say that even Mr. Black Tiger can't handle Tachan, he gets hit, which properly planned, Seihi hits the very spot that becomes the final destination for the wooden monster. And just like that, Seihi emerges victorious from the battle with the wood spirits by putting an end to them. At this, Seihi, looking at the downed trunk of a huge tree, hears the question asked of him about whether this is the end. And that contributes to Seihi sticking a battle weapon into the ground to finally put a stop to the matter, at the point of impact, which forms a huge rift dividing the surface into two parts. And now being inside him and looking down, he begins to ask questions that form the further plan of his action, which is that Seihi not paying attention to what's going on outside of him is forming a downward rift. However, the impact is so strong that it leaves Seihi unable to move for a while, and the domain mistress looking on was sure that Seiha's battle with her puppets would force the Black Tiger to retreat. In fact, Sanshin is a little confused that Seihi had the temerity to venture into her domain. And on top of that, Sanshin notices a jade bead around Seiha's neck that is supposed to break her spell. But since Seihi happens to be in Sanshin's territory, the Black Tiger is going to regret it a lot. In the meantime, Seihi himself only has to look at who he will be fighting in the very near future. And when Seihi finally sees his immediate enemy, he's glad Sanshin is showing him up, since Seihi is now facing no ordinary Sanshin, but the one who is called the Mother of the Dungeon. But this discovery doesn't matter much to Seiha, and he heads off to meet his enemy without a second thought, who, seeing the pressure Mr. Black Tiger is putting on her, is starting to back away. After all, Sanshin doesn't even have any plans to engage in battle with Mr. Black Tiger, who, if not afraid, should follow her. And Mr. Black Tiger does not hesitate to follow Sanshin, but the thick fog prevents him from seeing. And if it wasn't for the jade bead fortune teller Tang Yen had given him, Mr. Black Tiger wouldn't have been able to see anything at all. Seeing Sanshin disappear into his hole, Seihi realizes that she's trying to lure him in so she can attack it. However, Mr. Black Tiger is not ready to give up so quickly, and keeping his battle weapons ready, continues to follow Sanshin, the tail of which is beginning to be seen in one of the many nooks and crannies of her underground domain. And Seihi still keeps up the pace thanks to Tang En's Jade Bead, but he's still as fast as Sanjin's retreating Sanshin. Suddenly, Mr. Black Tiger notices that Sanshin disappears from his sight, causing Seihi to stop in surprise. And as he continues to peer deep into the burrow of the underworld, Seihi falls into a bit of a delusion, since Sanshin's trail breaks, and that's because she either ran away or hid her presence that way. Yeah. And anyway, Seihi doesn't understand why he's so out of breath, even considering that Black Tiger-san is in the cave. And then Mr. Black Tiger's gaze begins to pick up some extraneous movement from outside, which is triggered by the fact that the newfound wooden monsters are taking up their old ways in the form of an attack on Seihi, who, holding his battle weapon at the ready, doesn't quite understand how the wooden monster managed to get to this place. And Mr. Black Tiger has no choice but to strike again, with his battle weapon at the wooden monster, which this time, as in previous times, does not have time to dodge and falls under the hot hand of Mr. Black Tiger. But it doesn't end there, as Mr. Black Tiger himself, although he makes a strike, is also captured. During which Mr. Black Tiger not only strikes again, but also tries to grab the monster to finish him off. And actually, the Black Tiger-san is starting to get the hang of it as Seihi clutches his battle weapon even tighter and strips the monster, which, breaking apart into its component parts, begins to retreat from Mr. Black Tiger, taking the darkness with it. And Seihi himself analyzes the battle and concludes that this is the first time he has used the Black Tiger's power for so long in the last 3 years. But Seihi can't relax for long, because at that very moment, Sanshin's fangs appear above him, streaking the air, and Mr. Black Tiger, who had time to bounce back in time, takes a fighting stance in preparation for Sanshin's new antics, who was originally going to deal with Mr. Black Tiger quickly, but this failure saddens her. However, Sanshin is only happy that Mr. Black Tiger, having taken a sip of her poison, will soon be unable to overpower himself and will simply fall asleep. Sanshin will make sure to keep Mr. Black Tiger in his body and present it to Mr. Taesan afterwards. But that's not in the plans of Mr. Black Tiger, who doesn't understand how Sanshin could fall for the idea that some of Seihi's poison would stop him. But that's not true, because even Black Tiger, who is very strong and has captured all of Donghei's Sanshin, is powerless from the effects of the poison. If we take into account that the current Black Tiger is not what it used to be, Taekon will be happy to see him in human form. And Seihi couldn't agree more, offering Sanshin to voluntarily take him to Mr. Tahan. And Sanshin, listening to Seihi's speech, decides that he is trying to make a deal with her, but first she asks him to listen to her proposal, which is for Mr. Black Tiger to leave the cave and leave the village forever. Yes, and besides, the Dungeon Mother absolutely did not care what Black Tiger would do. Otherwise, he would engage in an endless battle with her. However, it is worth considering that Mr. Black Tiger is already poisoned and therefore more likely to lose. And the mother of the dungeon, deciding to bring Mr. Black Tiger outside, doesn't have time to speak, so a battle weapon cuts through the air above her head. At that, the mother of the dungeon dodged the blow in time to look out from her ambush and try to assess the stoppage. And seeing Seiha's belligerent posture, he concludes that he is thus reneging on the deal and will not leave her domain. Since that was the case, the mother of the dungeon would still wait for Mr. Black Tiger to pass out before picking up his stiffened body. However, the speeches made by the mother of the dungeon have no effect on the attacking Seihi, who is assuming the posture of an attacker, as Mr. Black Tiger looks into the face of the mother of the dungeon and tells her that he will not let her go. But Sanshin is already out of sight of the Black Tiger Master, standing there starting to call out for him once again. And seeing that Seihi doesn't move, the dungeon mother thinks he knows that sudden movements make the poison spread faster through the body. At that, under the incessant stream of Sanshin's endless words, Seihi notices the wooden monster reassembling itself, and in order to prevent the wooden monster from rising again, Mr. Black Tiger simply decides to trample it. At this, Seihi himself, though using jade bead magic, starts rubbing his eyes with his hand, and when his eyesight returns to Mr. Black Tiger, he starts looking around. The mother of the dungeon, who is moving along her paths, thinks that since the cave is soaked in poison, Seihi should stop moving. And once Mr. Black Tiger takes another 20 breaths, the poison will completely fill him up, and Sanshin should hide to wait it out. But the Dungeon Mother's plans were not destined to come true, as she notices that Seihi is following her. Moreover, Mr. Black Tiger does not look poisonous, rather. On the contrary, his determination says the opposite. And that doesn't sit right with Sanshin, who was 100% sure that the poison was meant to throw Seihi off her trail. To which Mr. Black Tiger replies with confidence that the Dungeon Mother underestimated Tang Ying's abilities. Or maybe also that Taishan, who empowered the Mother of the Dungeon, couldn't explain everything properly. With that, Mr. Black Tiger had already overtaken the Mother of the Dungeon and thrust his battle weapon into her body, which causes the Mother of the Dungeon unbearable pain, from which she begins to scream. And Mr. Black Tiger, referring to Sanshin, wants to know if it's true that she was able to stand up to Seiha after receiving power from Tachan. But even so, Mr. Black Tiger catches up with Sanshin again, and ignoring her pleas thinks that Taichan is a coward. At the same time, the Mother of the Dungeon, realizing that she is doomed and grasping at the slightest chance, wants to tell where Takan is hiding, but it no longer makes any difference at all to Mr. Black Tiger, who finally catches up with the Mother of the Dungeon. Since having absorbed the Mother Dungeon, all the memories in her head would still become available to the Black Tiger Master. However, something stops Seihi halfway through, and he doesn't finish what he started until the end. At the same time, the Mother of the Dungeon, not realizing that something is starting to happen to Seihi, is dreadfully awaiting her end, who seems so close to her that the Dungeon Mother closes her eyes in fear. But to the surprise of the Dungeon Mother, nothing happens, and to scout the situation, she decides to peek. And once she realizes that the danger has passed, the Mother of the Dungeon is happy to realize that her poison is beginning to take effect. And it all happens because the Mother of the Dungeon stabs Seiha's body with her sharp spades, forcing him to stop. Still, that doesn't stop him, and Seiha manages to reach the Dungeon Mother's head, clutching it tightly. However, the Mother of the Dungeon also manages to escape the consequences this time, as she pushes off Seiha, who notices that at this very moment, one of the Dungeon Mother's offshoots is clutching his hand, which contains a battle weapon. Oh, and to top it off, the Dungeon Mother's many legs are beginning to encircle Seiha's entire body. At that, the Mother of the Dungeon, on whose head Mr. Black Tiger is still leaning, tries to throw him over. And this is successfully obtained by the Mother of the Dungeon, who is freed from the clutches of Mr. Black Tiger, flying over her, who is piloting upside down, trying not to lose sight of the jade bead preparing to fall. And this does not go unnoticed by the emerging victor from this battle of the Mother Dungeon. But luckily for Mr. Black Tiger, he manages to land on his feet without losing his bearings, and the Mother of the Dungeon, adopting an attacking posture, aims all her possible weapons at Seihi, who accepts the challenge and is already rushing at his attacking enemy Sanshin, who, realizing that she might lose in this fight to Mr. Black Tiger, decides to put a fog on him, which completely envelops Mr. Black Tiger, throwing him off his chosen path. But once the fog clears a bit and visibility begins to return to Seihi, he notices two fangs pointed at him, which he chops apart with one swipe of his battle weapon, depriving Sanshin of the chance to strike. Suddenly, Mr. Black Tiger's side vision notices a third extra appearing in this game, and that third extra is none other than the wooden monster who grabs exactly the hand where Seiha's battle weapon is. And the Mother of the Dungeon, realizing that an unfavorable outcome might follow for the Black Tiger Master, is happily watching. At this, the wooden monster that had encroached on the Black Tiger Master's martial weapon flew back with force. But the Mother of the Dungeon herself, who receives a strong blow from Mr. Black Tiger, is not left out, which also throws the Mother of the Dungeon back with force, erasing the smile of pleasure from her face. And Mr. Black Tiger, although he is devoid of battle weapons, is still infused with the power of the Black Tiger, with which Seihi skillfully wields his fists to continue striking at Sanshin, as suddenly something stops Seihi, causing him to take his mind off the battle and turn his attention elsewhere, because at that very moment, Seihi notices that his battle weapon is right where the wooden monster is located. Moreover, the monster's wooden clawed hand is just where the hilt of Mr. Black Tiger's battle weapon is. Who, assessing the situation though, managed to pull the sword out of his body, but still doesn't know how long the power will last. Which means you have to switch and rush to get your hands on a battle weapon, but so does the wooden monster. And now, Mr. Black Tiger, holding his fist at the ready, is rushing to not only seize the sword, but also to throw away the wooden puppet, which, when it fails to reach its target, flies backwards with a crackling and furious force. Meanwhile, Seihi is already a millimeter away from grabbing the hilt of a battle weapon, with which Seihi just has to chop up the Mother of the Dungeon to stop all the dolls that are starting to pounce on him. Seihi sees each of the wooden dolls trying to bite him, and realizes that all the others are following one of them in pursuit. And to get rid of the pesky wooden monsters as quickly as possible, Seihi decides to fight them off, at the same time grumbling that the wooden monsters make too much noise, which makes your eyes go dark. And to stop it, Mr. Black Tiger blows the wooden puppet apart with a single blow, which, among other things, falls to the stone floor of the dungeon and is crushed by Seihi's foot, who is once again working hard to get to his battle weapons as soon as possible. But no matter how hard Mr. Black Tiger tries, all his attempts are in vain, as it is too late. And seeing the wooden puppets heading towards him again, Seihi realizes that his obsession with revenge will one day take his life. However, even in his worst dreams, Mr. Black Tiger did not think that death would come to him in a place like this. And the mother of the dungeon gleefully looks at Seihi and thinks he's just a loser, destined to perish in her domain. And besides, it's too late to fix anything for someone who should have been stiffed a long time ago. After all, it wouldn't even take a breath of poison for the dungeon mother to rip off Seiya's limbs and give the rest to Tachon. Suddenly, something happens that no one expects to see as a child's voice begins to address the wooden monsters, which brings some consternation to the already relaxed Sanshin so skillfully sharing the victory. As at this very moment, the satisfied smirk is wiped off the dungeon mother's face by Sori's punch, and Seiki, who thought his minutes were numbered, is hit by a shockwave that brings him to his senses. What happens because Sori is out of his mind with anger and starts smashing everyone left and right, throwing ice arrows. And that's how Sori presents himself in front of Seihi in all his glory, admiring his work. And Seihi, barely recovering from what he saw, is probably very happy that Seihi can move. But his joy was premature, as Sori's eyes blurred before he could speak, and he began to lurch to the side. And all Seihi wants first and foremost is to help the poison girl who came to his rescue. Suddenly, instead of touching Sori, Seihi's hand touches the hilt of his battle weapon, which causes an undisguised mixture of surprise and horror to reflect in Mr. Black Tiger's eyes. Because first of all, it's a battle weapon that Seihi needed, and secondly, it's served by a healthy Sori. But apparently that's not the concern of Seihi, who praises Sori and asks her to gently remove her hands from the blade of the battle weapon, which is immediately done by Sori, whose hand does not take damage from the martial weapon that emanates the Black Tiger's energy. And the mother of the dungeon, who witnessed the whole picture, begins to realize that this will be the end of her. And the dungeon mother's eyes are already reflecting her probable outcome, which comes from the Black Tiger Master looking at her, which now appears in full force in the form of Seiha beginning to advance on the mother of the dungeon, who, realizing what would follow, hesitates to move in anticipation of its end. Meanwhile, Mr. Black Tiger takes his time in enacting his retribution and decides to look around. And the first place Seiha's gaze falls is where the nibbled bones of pets and livestock rest near the wall. And on the other side, numerous human remains are gathered in a neatly stacked pile. That said, it seems that this is enough for Mr. Black Tiger to get on with his immediate mission. And the mother of the dungeon, seeing Mr. Black Tiger preparing to thrust his battle weapon, asks for mercy in exchange for information. But that doesn't stop Mr. Black Tiger, who is completely consumed by his thirst for revenge. And besides, Mr. Black Tiger goes back to what he said earlier about this information not playing a role for him. And thus, in the attachments of the mother of the dungeon, comes the end of the insect-like Sanshin. With Seihi's destruction of the monster, his memories become available where Sanshin catches the millipede in the form of a girl. And this girl becomes very curious if the insect can also become a Sanshin, for which in exchange, she will receive the simplest village to destroy. Yes, and to whom the girl is given a black worm that will have control over small animals, and wooden dolls can come to life. That being said, Sanshin can eat as much as her soul desires to spread rumors about it all over Dongha, and she starts with cattle. Small pets like the village dogs are already following. But Sanshin doesn't want the rumors to spread all over Dongha, so he'll do everything quietly, following his own discretion. And it will happen very slowly, taking its time, until Sanshin consumes the last person in the village. And Mr. Black Tiger, seeing the memories of the dungeon, Mother doesn't understand who this woman who appeared to him is, again. But it's time to call it a day and get out, and Mr. Black Tiger pulls his battle weapon from the millipede's defeated body. Sori, still under the influence of the poison, but firmly in his arms, inquires about the fate of the millipede. And hearing about Sori being trapped in the dungeon, she says she's allowed to come to the aid of Seihi, who can hardly handle it alone. To which Seihi wants to know who gave Sori that permission, but is wrong in assuming it was Tan-en, since it was the cat that Seihi and Sori encountered in the village that was able to guide Sori into the dungeon mother's domain. But to shift his focus to being able to get out of the dungeon, Seihi asks Sori to share her power, and with the Black Tiger's power gone, Seihi starts to lose sight again, where Sanshin's spell may still be active, and the only salvation for them may be the jade necklace given to Seihi in Tang-en's journey. Meanwhile, the road begins to drive Seihi and Sori into a dead end, bifurcating into several moves. And if it goes on like this, the two of them will disappear in the cave as a familiar black cat suddenly appears on their way again, who deftly jumps aside and motions for Seihi and Sori to follow her. And Seihi, trying to put his thoughts together, doesn't realize what kind of beast it is that has Sanshin's power as well. And since that's the case, Seihi has no choice but to go after the black cat. As Seihi continues on his journey, he begins to second-guess himself, and everything previously incomprehensible becomes quite obvious. And it is particularly worth starting with the deplorable situation in the long-suffering village, because if you think about it even better and spread it out, from the very beginning, the spirit has been leading Seihi and Sori from the very beginning. Meanwhile, at the end of Seiha's movement, still holding Sori on his back, a gap was beginning to show, and as soon as Seihi reaches him, he sees the cat frozen in front of him waiting for them, the outline of which begins to fade before Seiha's eyes, promising her eventual disappearance. And Seihi realizes this and begins to think through their next steps, seeing this as the end of the road, because at that very moment, Seihi looks up, and that's where the cat believes the exit from the dungeon to be. And the next thing Seihi does is to forcefully push off the stone dungeon floor with Sori on his back and jump outside. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tang Yen, having already taken on a human form, is patiently awaiting the arrival of her guests, which after making a huge path to the exit with force collapses in a leap to the ground next to Tang Yen. And the first thing Seihi does is resort to his battle weapon, wanting to use it against someone who didn't hide his name. Since it is Tan Yen aka Tan Yan, who is the Sanshin who has taken on human form now, looks up to Seihi. That being said, Tong Yeon was genuinely happy that Seihi and Sori were able to escape the dungeon completely unharmed. But this is not to Seihi's liking, who is about to absorb Sanshin to replenish his strength, but doesn't have time. As at that very moment, Seihi along with Sori falls to the ground with all her might, losing consciousness. And looking down on them, Tang Yen now sees how strong the one whose name inspires fear in everyone. But to Sanshin's surprise, he's just an ordinary boy whose heart is filled to the brim with longing. A short time later, Seihi begins to regain consciousness, but now he is lying in bed. And this bed is not somewhere but in a real house belonging probably to a man. But that's not what worries the recovering Seihi. It's where his battle weapon is now. And as soon as Black Tiger Master's hand touches the hilt of the martial weapon, the excitement gradually lets go. At this time, Tong Yen appears in the window opening, seeing that Mr. Seihi has woken up with a tray in his hands, who, with a benevolent expression on her face, offers Seihi what she has. But Seihi, seeing Sanshin in front of him, is unwilling to engage in dialogue with him, only adopting a belligerent posture. However, this does not scare Mrs. Tang Yen at all as she walks inside the room without a drop of doubt. And believing that there is still poison in Mr. Seihi's body causing dry throat, he offers him water before eating. And Seihi, instead of accepting the offer, asks Tan Yong not to pretend since she sees everything perfectly. But Tang Yen, catching on with her answer, says that she knows that even with her strength, she can't escape from Mr. Black Tiger. However, this isn't an argument for Seiha, who doesn't care at all what Mrs. Tang En will do in this case. After all, Seihi is more interested in why Mrs. Tang En saved him knowing that he would devour her anyway. After all, Tang Yen could essentially take Seihi's life at any time while he was unconscious. However, Ms. Tang Yen does not pursue the goal of destroying people under the guise of threatening lives. And Tang Yen keeps her eyes open not because she's trying to hide her identity, but because she sees too much when they're open. Still, returning to the original topic of their conversation, Mrs. Tang In reminds her about the food for Seiha, which he doesn't have time to answer, because from somewhere above, Sori happily announces that she can eat everything. At that, Mrs. Tang In immediately informs, looking at Sori, that she has just recently eaten. But that doesn't convince Sori in any way to give up her desire to eat the food again if Seihi doesn't want it. And to avoid this, however, Mrs. Tang Yen wants, she asks Sori to wait a bit and the food will be ready. As soon as Sori realizes that she has achieved what she wants, she immediately descends from the roof, landing at the entrance to the houses. And not wanting to waste time, Seihi, with hope in his voice, that Seihi will refuse the food, asks permission to eat it. However, to Sori's surprise, after some deliberation, Seihi answers her with an emphatic refusal. A short time later, Seihi is sitting next to Tan Yen and thinks she has a special story to tell. But Tan Yen is just a simple cat who lived with a fortune teller. At the same time, for a long time Tan Yen absorbed the power of a fortune teller, as a result of being able to predict the future. There is also the possibility that Tan Yen was Sanshin from the beginning, but lived like a normal cat, without worrying about anything. However, none of the fortune tellers in her generation cared about her appearance, from the daughter of her first cohabitant to the first daughter of her second. Seihi wonders why Tan Yong doesn't call them mistresses, but calls them roommates, but asks them not to think about it in time. And that's how Tan Yen, living with fortune tellers for generations, becomes a fortune teller herself. But that's not all Seihi wants to know, as the next question becomes what became of Tan Yun's roommates. Tong Yen replies that decades ago, the last of the fortune tellers passed away without giving birth to a descendant, and Tan Yong, following the will of her roommates, began to take care of the house where she now lives. And so ends the story of Mrs. Tan Yen, who decides it is appropriate to address Seihi by his direct name. But Seihi doesn't care how he is treated by Tan Yun, who decides to ask him a question about what will happen to her next. At the same time, Sori, who had recently been sitting at Tan Yen's feet, shifted her attention to a cat passing by. And jumping to her feet, Sori throws herself at the cat, making promises that she will cuddle her very gently. And as the cat from surprise begins to freeze on the spot, Sori, deciding that luck favors her, throws at the cat with a victory cry. But Sori fails miserably, and instead of the warm embrace of a cat's body, she gets a mark on her face from a paw strike. Meanwhile, the cat comes out of the game victorious and continues on its way, leaving Sori to regret the missed opportunity. With Seihi watching Sori chase after the cat, it's interesting how a fortune teller can't know her future, to which Tan Yen quite rightly gives the answer, that there are fortune tellers who can read one's destiny. And Seihi, repeating Tan Yen's question about her fate, decides to eat her. But first he wants to know if there's a Sanshin stronger than Tan Yang nearby. And if this question is answered by Tang Yin, she will be rewarded with saving her life from Seiha, who she thinks is asking the wrong question. Because really, at this point, Seiha's goal isn't to find a Sanshin who's stronger, since he is now looking for a Sanshin who can answer all the questions that plague his soul. After all, following Tang Yin's predictions, a child named Seihi will never do evil for the sake of getting his own exit. That said, now Seihi is spilling the blood of innocent Sanshins to get answers to all his questions. And Tang Yeon continues to talk about Seihi's essence before she can finish, as she is interrupted by Seihi pushing Tang Yeon against the wall. And ordering Tang Yen to stop talking nonsense again puts her in a choice to either say goodbye to her life or designate another Sanshin's place. Seihi thinks that Tang Yen will make the right choice, but ends up hearing that cats by nature choose what they like. And besides, how can Tang Yen trade the lives of those Sanshin she likes for her own, thereby asking her to take her life painlessly? And now Seihi is faced with the choice of sending Tang Yen to the other world by absorbing her or keeping her alive. Meanwhile, Seihi's battle weapon filled with Black Tiger energy was getting closer and closer to Tang Yen's face. At the same time, the cats that were previously lying serenely on the bowls now have their tails tipped and are watching what is going on. And Sori herself, who has gotten her way and grabbed the cat in her arms, is watching Seihi and Tang En in bewilderment, on whose neck Mr. Black Tiger's grip unclenches and she slumps unharmed to the veranda floor. And Seihi turned away from Tang En, no longer daring to look her in the eye, with the certainty of having lost, headed for the exit. And picking up his headdress and knot from the ground, Seihi retreats at this, but he hears the suggestion to stay longer, since Tang En believes that neither Seihi nor his traveling companion Sori are fully healed yet. But hearing that Seihi has had enough rest, Tan Yong decides to propose to him, which is so that Tang Yen can tell us about that Sanshin that Mr. Black Tiger wants so badly. And after Seihi meets this Sanshin, he has to show him all his doubts to find a solution. And it seems that this answer suits Seihi, who is interested in the location of this Sanshin after learning about Mount Banwan. With that, after getting answers to all of Seihi's questions so far, calling after him, Sori heads for the exit. And Tan Yong, now acting as the Black Tiger, says that this time he'll let her go, but she shouldn't let him see her. But then there's Han Seihi, who bows his head to Dewa Tan Yon to express his sincere gratitude. At the same time, Tong Yen herself addresses Mr. Black Tiger and Han Seihi, saying that the doors of her house are always open to them. And on that note, Han Seihi, along with his wayfarer Sori, leaves Tan En's house and the village itself. And Tan Yen sees the guests off and asks them to be careful, while expressing her resentment to her cat, who looks at her roommate and has no idea what she's talking about. That said, Tan-young says that how could her cat take a swing at such a creepy Sanshin who is still a kid? And hearing that the cat is beginning to join Tang-yen on the prairie, her roommate suggests they go home already, because when the villagers learn that the fear and terror of the fog has dissipated, they will be overcome with longing for their dead relatives, which will add to Tan-yen's work. Meanwhile, Sei-hee continues to follow the path he's on, remembering Tan-young's words that he knows everything without prophecies. At the same time, Sei-hee should keep in mind that their pursuers are already heading towards that place, which means they need to be careful. And sometime later, somewhere far away in the snowy mountains, in a place surrounded by trees, a silhouette is visible, which on closer inspection looms into the figure of a woman sitting on a rock. In this case, a woman in complete peace surrounded by nature seems to be waiting for something by adopting a confirming pose. Suddenly, this state of mind of the woman is interrupted by the appearance of a man addressing her by the name of the shaman, Chi-ul, who doesn't realize who dared to disobey her order not to interfere, but stops in time to see who is in front of her, namely a stalker of Seiha and Sori named Hongshik, who doesn't understand what Shaman Chi-ul is doing outside in this cold, who immediately responds that she hunts, and the warriors only get in her way, so she sends them away. But that's not the main thing, because is it true what is written in the letter? Namely that Huimori is on the loose, and now they are moving towards Ji-ul. And this surprises Ji-ul, who doesn't understand how, after all, Sori decides to return to Ji-ul's house, who now gets a new chance to catch her. Suddenly, a pile of small snowstones from an unknown direction flew straight at Chi-ul, who, with a flick of her hand, catches rocks on the fly without even blinking an eye. Meanwhile, Ji-ul continues to have a conversation with Hongshik regarding the guy who took Huimori away with a suspicious assault weapon, because even though the girl Huimori herself is directly behind the destruction of the hangnail, but the burr only shrank in size after making contact with Seiha's battle weapon. However, it cannot be said with absolute certainty that Seihi's battle weapons do not draw their power from blood, but it is not certain. And Sei-hee himself didn't show any unusual strength in the battle, as even Chilson could handle him alone, which explains a lot. After all, it is very common for Sanshins to return to their original form after losing their lives. And since Ji-ul's prediction doesn't indicate any particular threat from Seiha, Hongshik doesn't have to worry about it. And besides, according to the predictions of Ji-ul Sahi and his traveling companion Sori, they're bound to split up someday. And only when that happens will Ji-ul and Hongshik and their men eliminate them one by one. And at this point, the conversation between Hongshik and Ji-ul ends as the other case succeeds. But Hongshik doesn't understand what's going on, certain that they're in danger, wonders what's going on. But all of Hongshik's worries are in vain, as the shamaness Chi-ul happily announces that she has managed to catch the master of this mountain. Immediately, Hongshik, following the mute instruction of the shamaness, Chi-ul whistles to summon his men, who appear out of nowhere in large hordes from behind the snow-covered hills. With that, Hongshik looks at his men and starts giving orders for the first squad to go to the ridge and the rest to hold on to it. And Shaman Chi-ul, seeing how organized Hongshik is, manages to praise him for his service, for which Hongshik himself is extremely grateful to the Shaman Chi-ul, as her word alone is enough for him, since the Shaman Chi-ul is one of the most powerful shamans, and Hongshik sees nothing wrong with fulfilling her whims. Still, it's a shame for Honshiku that, after months of hunting, he has no idea what a Huin-wielding Sanshin looks like. However, the shaman Chi-ul is in no hurry to answer, because she wants to know what Hongshik himself thinks about her question. His guesses are somewhat poor, for perhaps, according to Hongshik, the owner of the highest mountain in Dongha must be a dragon or tiger. And the shamanist Chi-ul, hearing such an answer, says that everyone has such a wrong opinion, because the height of the mountain has nothing to do with the size of the host. And to prove the truth of her words, the shaman Chi-ul asks Hongshik to take a look at the master of the mountain himself, which appears as a human roe deer caught in a trap set for it, sitting in the snow. And Hongshik, looking at the master of the mountain, realizes that he could never have guessed who she was, even by looking at her. However, this is how the first encounter between the shamaness Chi-ul and the master of the mountain, Mrs. Snow Roe. She looks at her wounded leg and wonders why Ji-ul is doing this, but the latter is just following orders from above. But the shaman's words do not inspire confidence in Snow Roe, who knows that Chi-ul is a shaman from the community acting on her own accord. However, Chi-ul must let Miss Snow Roe go, because if she doesn't leave the mountain, a huge disaster will befall this place. And Hongshik, looking at the Snow Roe, thinks that he is under a spell because she has not even said a couple of words, and he already wants to let her go. At that, it seems to Honshiku that Lady Snow-Ro hugging him reminds him of the guilt he feels for the unpardonable sin. But Snow-Ro's words don't stop Chi-ul, who believes that if disaster strikes the mountain, then everything goes according to plan. Besides, the Snow-Ro doesn't have to worry about it, so all it has to do is sleep soundly in the iron cage prepared for it. And hearing this, Mrs. Snow-Ro closes her eyes with a resigned look and begins to accept the inevitable. And the shamanist Ji-wul realizes that they can't avoid a clash and asks Hongshik to prepare for battle. But Hongshik is still reeling from the effects of the Snow-Ro lady's atomizing charms, but he doesn't have time to react immediately. And as soon as he starts to realize what's going on, he quickly turns his gaze to the warrior squad. At that, Hongshik, seeing that there is someone else besides them that has the strength, orders everyone to disperse. But not everyone manages to fulfill the instructions in time, because at that time, a huge bear starts to scatter them. At the same time, a new wave of warriors from Honshika's squad took an attacking stance and pointed their battle weapons at the bear, and the other part of the trained warriors, on the contrary, adopting a defensive stance to protect Shaman Chi-wul. In the meantime, Sanshin, in the form of a huge bear, having disposed of some of the warriors, is already advancing on his opponents. Mrs. Snow-Ro, realizing how the matter will end, asks Dodal to stay away from them. But Dodal, full of the desire to protect his named sister, no longer hears the words that they cannot be fought. And already completely enraged, scattering Honshik's men around, Dodal strives for his goal, which is the shamanist Chi-ul calmly awaiting the approach of Sanshin Dodal. After all, according to Chi-ul, Dodal is not stupid at all if he knows who to attack in this situation. Meanwhile, Dodal stands before Chi-wul and raises his clawed paw to strike. But Dodal misses, and instead of his desired target, he receives a talisman glued to his forehead from the shamaness Chi-ul, who calms Dodal, and Ji-wul looks at him and notes that he's well built and could be the master of the mountain. And Mrs. Snow-Ro, seeing Dodal-chan suffering, tries to divert Chi-wul's attention to herself by asking her to let the bear go. But Ji-wul doesn't think it's right, as the gallbladder of the bear endowed with Sanshin's power will add a lot of strength to her own. However, Ji-wul doesn't know what to do with the bear and orders Hongshik to deal with it on the spot. And so, Hongshik, following his mistress's instructions, and his warriors attacked from behind and plunged their battle weapons into Dodal's back. And Mrs. Snow-Ro, seeing that Dodal-chan is on the verge of death and life because of her, still tries to help him. At the same time, the shamanist Chi-wul, looking at Snow-Ro's efforts instead of helping her, asks her what to do with Dodal-chan. And learning that Hongshik's subordinates should be at the bamboo grove, he orders the bear to be dismembered and the roe deer to be carried as it is. But then something happens that no one expected, as Dodal-chan rips off his talisman and tosses Ji-wul and Hongshik aside. Meanwhile, Dodal-chan himself is once again beginning to straighten out his enemies from Hongshik's unit. At the same time, the shamanist Chi-wul, believing that Dodal is being ignorant by doing so, orders him to stop. And the most important thing Hongshik's men have to do is keep Dodal from getting close to Snow-Ro, who, seeing that Dodal is trying to help her, asks her to leave to avoid capture and not to touch the chain on which the enchantment is attached. But it's too late, as soon as Dodal tries to chew the chain, the enchantment on it hurts him badly. However, Dodal, though very exhausted, still achieves his goal and chews the chain that chained the Snow-Ro to the ground. Already grabbing Snow-Ro in his arms and realizing that the two of them are not destined to survive, Dodog decides to act. And the first thing Dodal does while holding Snow-Ro on her shoulder is ask her to be careful about landing. At the same time, Mrs. Snow-Ro, before she has time to speak, finds herself high in the sky as Dodal tosses her up. And once Mrs. Snow-Ro is at a safe distance, she takes one last look at Dodal, who asks Mrs. Snow-Ro to leave as soon as possible, as he himself decides to detain Ji-wul and Hongshik with the squad. In doing so, Mrs. Snow-Ro must promise Dodal, who is already being approached from behind by Hongshik's men, to take care of himself. And Dodog, realizing that he will never get off the mountain alive again, thanks the Snow-Ro for everything she has done for him. And thus, in a clearing among Hoshika's troop, Sanshin finds his final resting place in the form of a bear named Dodal. And approaching Hoshiku, the shamanist Chi-wul now surely wants to make sure Dodal is deprived of life, to which Hoshik and his warriors reply that Dodal is really dead this time. However, this doesn't convince the shamaness, since last time, Hoshik also said the same thing with 100% certain, which clearly hurt Hoshika's feelings, who didn't know Dodal could move after his heart had been stabbed 3 times. But since this time, the case in destroying Dodal still succeeds, the shaman Chi-ul resorts to a talisman,